Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up, and make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video, and yeah, let's begin. Okay, so I don't know how many of you guys have been tracking this, but Donny Cates, he went on Twitter a little while ago and said that Absolute Carnage was supposed to be like the definitive Carnage story, right? Like the greatest Carnage story ever told. And I believe him, because like with his run on Venom, like everything he's done on Venom, it's been nothing short of spectacular. And the way this first part ends, I'm excited to see what happens. But for those of you guys who are kind of jumping into this for the first time, a couple things I would suggest here. The first is to go back and watch our videos on Venom, and we'll have we'll have all the videos down in the description. We'll probably do a full story video out of it, so you kind of have you're caught up on essentially everything. But then we'll also I also suggest you guys watch my video on Carnage Explained. That way, between those two things, you can get caught up. I did call Carnage Venom a couple times, but people knew what I meant, so it's all good. But yeah, so this is amazing. Now, here's the cool thing about Absolute Carnage. If you choose not to do that, to really get caught up on Venom, to really get caught up on the history of Carnage, you can still kind of go into this and be okay. I think it'd be better knowing all that stuff, but you know, you could still be okay, because in true Donny Cates fashion, we get this sort of explanation of things that have happened up to this point, right? So basically we get this idea that at one point in time, in the very early days of this universe, right, before there was any real life in it, and all you really had were the Celestials, and presumably after they won their war with the Aspirants, you had Null the symbiote god. Now, of course, as we were told in the first run of Venom, the first volume of Venom, that Null the symbiote god was this being that was just sort of out there, right? You know, kind of existed in this void, this little pocket space inside the universe, created these symbiotes to essentially serve as his agents, right? To kind of spread his influence and chaos throughout the universe. Now, once he was finally defeated, once this major battle took place and he was finally locked away, this is when Donny Cates kind of ties into what Brian Michael Bendis did, right? Because if you go back and you read Guardians of the Galaxy by Brian Michael Bendis, he introduces the planet of the symbiotes, this idea that the Venom symbiote that runs around Earth originates from this particular planet of the Clintar. That's their actual name. The name of these symbiotes is called the Clintar, that it originated from that planet. Where we had previously just believed this is where the symbiotes were, and according to Brian Michael Bendis, that the symbiotes basically existed as like space knights, and then they would bond themselves to a host, and they would go on and perform great deeds. That if something like the Venom symbiote bonded someone like Eddie Brock, who was filled with anger and wrath, that it would twist the symbiote, it would warp it beyond its original purpose, and it would essentially become a bad guy. What Donny Cates had gone back and done is he had said that's not necessarily true. That the symbiotes were created out of evil, and the planet of the symbiotes is as much a prison as it is a location, in the sense that once Null was defeated, he was locked away inside of his own planet, or I guess inside this planet of the symbiotes, and the planet itself is just a giant ball of symbiotes that exists out there in the universe somewhere. And so once he was defeated, they kind of began changing their tune, essentially became good guys, and willingly locked him away as best they could. Now, the issue with this is kind of one of the cool things that Donny Cates goes into, is if you go back and you look at the history of Venom and the various symbiotes, so like Toxin, Carnage, so on and so forth, Shriek and whatnot, you had this idea where whenever a symbiote left an existing host and then went to a new host, they would basically maintain information about their previous host, right? It's one of the ways that the Venom symbiote was able to dodge Spider-Man's spider sense, right? Like, Spider-Man was the first one to hold the symbiote and then cast it off at the advice of Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four. And so when it left him, it felt betrayed, and then in turn bonded itself to Eddie Brock, who was already pissed off at Peter for costing him his job, but it took the knowledge of Spider-Man with him, right? So like the knowledge of Peter's identity, the knowledge of Spider-Man's spider sense and how it functions and how to get around it. That's one of the reasons why Venom was so capable and so dangerous back in the day. And so the result is that what Donny Cates is kind of building on here is saying that like every time a symbiote leaves a person, that it leaves a little imprint of itself, a tiny little bit of itself. Now, again, this is existing knowledge. This really isn't anything that Donny Cates has built off of, or I guess really created out of his pocket. What Donny Cates did is he came back and he said, these little codexes, these little itty bitty symbiote imprints that are left on a person's DNA, if they're all brought together, they can be used for the purpose of waking up Null on the symbiote planet and then bringing him back to life, kind of resurrecting him. And that really seems to be the motivation, or at least one of the big motivations behind the Carnage cult. Now, what Donny Cates has kind of been tinkering with, kind of been toying with, is this idea that Cletus Cassidy wants to resurrect Null for the purpose of killing him and taking his place, taking all of his power, and then controlling all the symbiotes across the universe. And to be honest, Carnage becoming God seems pretty insane, but that's really what happens here, right? Like, Carnage essentially becomes God in this bit, and that's what's kind of nuts, is because what it does is it switches over to Eddie Brock. Now, Eddie Brock is really kind of recounting all this stuff, right? Like saying all these different things and talking directly to Dylan. Now, again, in our first volume, we learned about the character of Dylan. We learned that Dylan is actually the son of Eddie Brock, but Eddie's basically led Dylan to believe he's simply his brother. And this is just because of the fact that Dylan is a son that Eddie never knew he had, right? That was just kind of dropped off at his father's house by a woman he was with at one point who ultimately ended up taking her own life. But because of the fact that his father was so abusive, Eddie wanted to get him out of there, right? He wanted to get him away from that life and have him live a normal life. The downside of this is that as they're making their way in New York City, suddenly, like, all these different, digital billboards are met with like these wanted posters for Eddie Brock himself. And so, like, the whole world is aware of who he is. The whole world is aware that, like, he's a dangerous man that needs to be captured. Now, this is the cool thing here, because when this happens, you basically have Cletus Cassidy, who kind of pops out of nowhere and then sends Eddie and Dylan flying over into really in like the way of this oncoming subway train. Now, this is one of the cool things here, is because when Eddie was talking to Dylan about who who Carnage was, Dylan was kind of like, the eyes and ears of like the new person, right? Like the new reader. He was kind of the new reader in the story, in the sense that people who were just jumping onto this don't really know the history of Carnage. They don't really know the legacy of Carnage. They don't really know the madness that came with Cletus Cassidy, the willful abandonment, right? Like just murdering with abandon all these different people that he came across for no other reason than the fact that he could, right? It wasn't like he was trying to become some super criminal to amass great wealth or to attain absolute power, and he did all these things because he just wanted to, because he just wanted to arbitrarily take people out. That's the kind of villain that Eddie's talking about right now. And that's, again, a villain. That's one of the things we talked about in our video on Carnage Explained. It's one of the kind of villains that you never really see. A villain who just shows up and just arbitrarily takes people out for no real reason whatsoever, aside from the fact that it's a nihilist and it just loves it loves madness and carnage. It loves its own namesake. And so, again, like, what we end up finding out here is that where Eddie and Dylan were running away from some man in a suit, that where Cletus Cassidy was the one who pushed them in front of the train, the man in the suit was actually the Venom symbiote. Now, for those of you guys who are kind of playing catch up here, there came a point during their first fight with what was essentially this giant dragon, this really old Grendel suit. It wasn't really Null, the symbiote god himself, so much as like a facsimile of Null, kind of like a taste of what would happen if Null ever came back in like full and true form. Not really as powerful as he could be, but certainly powerful enough to like wreak havoc in the city of New York. And of course, that story culminated with Eddie Brock grabbing the Venom symbiote and because fire is a weakness of the symbiotes, pushing Null, or at least his facsimile of Null, into a furnace, but also seemingly killing the Venom symbiote in the process. And so the result was that they were separated for an amount of time. Now, following this, what you had were basically two stories being told about Eddie Brock and then one about the Venom symbiote. The symbiote itself got its story in the War of Realms, right? It was basically dealing with everything with Malekith and so on and so forth. Malekith's dark magic, which we'll talk about here in a second. But then you basically had the story of Eddie trying to make his way and figure himself out. And that was one of the cool things about this, is because when the Venom symbiote shows back up and wants to bond itself to Eddie, the response of Eddie is, no, I don't want to. Like, I don't want to go back to this life again. And that's an important thing, because when Eddie first got the Venom symbiote, he saw it as a tool to be used to defeat Peter Parker, aka Spider-Man, for costing him everything. He was hell-bent on revenge and anger, and that was basically it. And then you started running into these stories where Eddie Brock began to sort of change his tune, where he began to become like a different kind of character. He became anti-Venom for a little while. He began to basically become like a good guy, almost like the reformation of Flash Thompson, right? The high school bully of Peter Parker who lost his legs in the military and went on to become Agent Venom. It's a cool thing in this scenario, because what Eddie Brock has discovered is a thing that really, as the reader, we kind of always knew, but Eddie was never really able to figure out for himself, that he's highly capable, that he's a very, very capable person. Now, the guilt of Eddie's past life, the idea that he and his friends had hit a kid when they were younger, his father got him off, these are the kind of things that have sort of driven him, that kind of made him the villain. But the idea of coming back and trying to reform, trying to be a better person, means casting off that past part of his life, which includes Venom. Being able to settle down, being able to raise his son, and to have some small measure of peace is the guiding force behind Eddie. The problem with this is now Carnage is back, and this is no small thing. thing, because when Carnage arrives here, like, all hell begins to break loose, right? Because you're talking about Cletus Cassidy, who for all intents and purposes should basically be dead, toting the power of one of the original symbiotes as it was created by Null the symbiote god, basically meaning it's more powerful than Eddie Brock, it's more powerful than Venom. So this is one of the cool things that's interesting here, because it's sort of a tribute of sorts, at least in the first part. I mean, not fully on in terms of the entirety of the story, but in this first part here, it's a tip of the hat to Maximum Carnage. When the Carnage symbiote bonded to Cletus Cassidy on the blood level, and he became just way more powerful than both Eddie Brock and Spider-Man, he was a force to be reckoned with. We're essentially dealing with the same concept, except amplified even further. It's a symbiote joined to Cletus Cassidy on the blood level, but it's a more powerful symbiote than both Venom and really like any other one that we see out there right now. So this is an exceedingly dangerous, incredibly powerful Carnage that's running around out there right now. And like, it really shows, because he basically one punches Eddie Brock. He punches him in the face. He breaks his orbital bone, his brain is hemorrhaging. I mean, in like one fell swoop, Eddie Brock's been taken out. That's the kind of Carnage that we're dealing with. Back in the day, it was really more like Carnage's durability, right? His ability to create all kinds of different sharp appendages and so on and so forth, and his insanity that made him almost unpredictable. That's really what made him such a huge force back in the day. And this one, it's just like the sheer force of the symbiote he wields, the power he possesses, is enough to like take out Eddie Brock in one hit. And so what Eddie does is respond in kind, doing the only thing he can do, grabbing the electrical lines of where the subway train was, and then grabbing Carnage, and then just electrocuting the piss out of him. And basically it destroys the Carnage symbiote, in the interim, but all it really does is it's really just kind of like temporarily send it into chaos. And that's basically it. It's a stopgap measure. And Eddie knows this, right? Eddie knows this is a stopgap measure. He knows there's no real way, as far as he's aware, to defeat Carnage in the traditional sense. And again, that makes sense, because in the Maximum Carnage storyline, it really took the combined efforts of Spider-Man and Venom to pull it off. Now, even the first time they met before Maximum Carnage, it took the combined efforts of Venom and Peter Parker, Spider-Man, to defeat this guy. And so again, we're dealing with a super amped up, very powerful version of Carnage. And so as a result of this, the Venom symbiote shuts down the mind of Eddie Brock, puts him in a catatonic state while he basically heals his body, and then takes him to the only place, the one place where they can get any real measure of help. And it's a cool thing, because we all knew this was coming. We all knew it was only a matter of time before this happened. What ends up happening here is that once they arrive to this location, the symbiote wakes up Eddie Brock, and they knock on the door of an apartment. And when this happens, somebody answers the door, and that's when we end up finding out the person the Venom symbiote took Eddie Brock to, the only real person he'd be able to get any help from in this situation, or at the very least, the only one who would listen to him, is Peter Parker, Spider-Man. Okay, so we are getting back into Absolute Carnage, and here's the thing. So the original Absolute Carnage, or I guess the first issue, was split into 3 parts, and for the most part, it looks like it's what they're gonna do from the issues going forward. I have not read the physical issue number 2 yet, so I'm not 100% sure. I've been on vacation for the last week, driving the Pacific Coast Highway, which was amazing. But kind of getting into this one, and then we'll actually do the 3rd part of the first issue later on this week, so we'll kind of wrap everything up. In the last one, it was really like the return of Cletus Cassidy, right? And that was a big thing that was people were really expecting and had really been told to us in the events leading up to Absolute Carnage. It was kind of the big takeaway from it, right? I mean, Cletus Cassidy is the original Carnage. He's a fan favorite, has been for a long time, and it's one of those things where unless it's Cletus Cassidy playing Carnage, people are kind of iffy about it. The only real exception to that is Norman Osborn when he was the Red Goblin. That was really cool. We'll actually talk about him here in a little bit. But what this does is it picks up with Peter and Eddie Brock, and then of course, Eddie's son Dylan, all basically getting together in converse. And the reason why is because, again, when it came to Carnage first popping up, of course it was Spider-Man and Venom who fought him, and then you went into Maximum Carnage, which was Spider-Man and Venom fighting him again. And the idea is that with someone like Carnage, it takes the two of them to succeed, because Carnage is so incredibly strong, right? The fact that the symbiote is bonded to the blood of Cletus Cassidy is what really amps up his powers beyond what you normally see with like Venom or anybody along those lines, anybody that normally wears a symbiote. And so it makes sense that you would see Eddie kind of team up with Spider-Man. Now, for long-time Carnage fans and really long-time Spider-Man fans, this kind of has to be a bit of a hit into the nostalgia feels, right? It's kind of like, man, this kind of feels a little bit old school. And that's why it's kind of a cool moment, is because a lot of things have transpired in the life of Eddie Brock that Peter Parker didn't know about. For example, Peter Parker does not know know that Dylan is the son of Eddie. Now, of course, when Eddie sends Dylan away and says, hey, look, go do something else, just don't be here, it's adult talking time. You guys all remember that from when you were kids. It's a chance for Eddie to basically sort of kind of let his guard down, right? And just sort of let the whole thing kind of be out there and say, hey, look, like, he's my kid. And this isn't really even about me. It's not even really about me stopping Carnage. It's about like stopping him to make sure that my kid's safe, right? Because if Carnage gets his hands on my kid, he'll kill him. And it's really just protecting people outside of myself. And that's why it's a really important thing, right? Because Eddie's been a bad guy. He's been a good guy. He's been a victim of circumstance. Spider-Man's seen a lot of things transpire with the character of Eddie. And this is kind of the newest take for his character insofar as he's out there and coping with a few things. And it works. And it's really cool to see because it kind of makes Spider-Man a little softer to him and say, okay, you know, I guess I can kind of get where you're coming from. But then suddenly they're met with a news broadcast and there's this mass grave that was essentially dug up out in the middle of nowhere. And initially it's kind of like, whatever, man, nobody wants to see this. They turn it off. Eddie Brock starts freaking out. Spider-Man's like, what the heck is going on? And he was like, everybody who's ever been a symbiote is buried out there. Like they're in that mass grave, right? And that's one of the big things that we recall from what we've been told, both during the prelude stories to Absolute Carnage and by the interviews that Donny Cates has done himself, that you have this circumstance where Cletus Cassidy is basically going around and grabbing what are called these codexes, right? These little codices pieces. And it's designed to basically like kind of recreate the whole, right? It's sort of been that way ever since Null popped up, in the sense that like when Null was there, he was the guy that created all the symbiotes. They function as a cohesive unit, and following his defeat, they've kind of been separated ever since. And it's the Carnage symbiote basically grabbing all these different iterations of either itself or Venom, and then combining them all into a singular unit, which will amplify his power even further, and then presumably try to take on Null and then, you know, destroy Null and then become like god of the symbiotes, which makes sense. It'd be actually really cool to see if Carnage like took over all the symbiotes and became their new god. But it's a cool little thing here, because what you get is this revelation, you know, where Eddie's freaking out and he's kind of panicking. The big thing to really come out of this is he's saying like Annie's body is buried out there somewhere. Now, for those of you guys who have not been keeping up with Donny Cates' run on Venom and really aren't longtime readers of the Spider-Man comics, the person he's referring to, Annie, she's actually a character that appeared back in Amazing Spider-Man 375 in 1993, and this is Annie Weying. Now, Annie Weying is actually the second person to host the Venom symbiote, and in fact, she used the name She-Venom at one point in time, but she's also the biological mother of Dylan. And for those, and the reason why I say Donny Cates' run is because in the early part of his run, when you basically got the introduction of Dylan's character, it was Annie was pregnant with Eddie Brock's son. She didn't want Eddie to know because, of course, he was Venom. He was a bad guy at the time. And so she basically gave birth to the kid, dropped it off at the father of Eddie Brock's house, and then just kind of left it there. And then eventually she went and jumped off a bridge and died. But the idea behind it is that basically his ex-wife is out there and that she can basically be used by Carnage to become one of his henchmen or what have you. It's kind of a crushing thing. And that's the reason why Eddie starts to freak out. Now, again, this is one of the cool things about his character, because if we're talking about like 1990s Venom, Lethal Protector, you know, and we're just sort of like, you know, he's out doing his own thing and being a bad guy, he probably wouldn't have cared about that. But the nature of Eddie is that over the years, his character has become a lot more dynamic, has become a lot more intriguing, and he's grown a lot in terms of what writers have done with him and kind of how he views the world. But it's a cool thing because it's kind of like, okay, so like the notion that Eddie Brock has a lot more on the line than Carnage is back, let's fight him. It's cool. It's something that I'm really, really digging about the way his character is being handled. That's why I love the Venom run from Donny Cates so much, because it's almost kind of seems to be more focused on Eddie than it is on the symbiote itself, right? I mean, the Venom symbiote's super popular. That kind of makes sense. And so in response to this, with everything kind of popping off the way that it is, there's some burglars that bust in and Spider-Man takes care of them quick, fast, and in a hurry. And it's kind of like, okay, you know, cool, whatever. And then he's like, we need to go see a guy that could basically help us get this stuff sorted out. And of course, that's when they basically go back to Rex Strickland's safe house. Of course, Rex Strickland being one of the previous hosts for the Grendel symbiotes, kind of the precursor to Venom, basically. And then of course, they're essentially talking with the Maker. Now, this is kind of a cool moment because the idea of the Maker meeting Spider-Man is a cool little thing, right? Because in Marvel, they never actually met before. Like they've never really met. I mean, even with Spider-Man there during the events of Secret Wars, like his dealings were with like Miles Morales and with the Molecule Man Owen Reese. And of course, you know, Reed Richards from his main universe, but like that was basically it. You know, the Maker kind of being out there and being part of the equation and everything. It's kind of a cool little moment here because, you know, when you have Eddie show up here, one of the things we end up learning is, again, the mysterious benefactors, the people that Maker works for that we don't really know who they are. It's basically like, hey, they had a lot of interest in using the Carnage symbiote or even the Venom symbiote itself. They want to know how to like use them for their own ends, either weaponizing them, using them for new technologies, whatever the case happens to be. But like they've been working on a means to extract the symbiote from individuals already and then do it in a way that's safe, that can preserve the life of the person who is infected. And so it's kind of a cool moment here because when this happens, you basically have like Spider-Man talking to him, but then also bringing in his godson, Normie Osborn. Now, Normie Osborn, okay, this character's interesting. He almost kind of has the Franklin Richards effect in the sense that like he first popped up back in like Amazing Spider-Man 285, and then like like nobody really did anything with him after that. Not for a long time. Normie Osborn really had his big moment during the Red Goblin storyline. And we never actually covered that, the go down swinging storyline. We never actually covered that. And I feel like we should, if for no other reason than the fact that like it ties in pretty neatly with Absolute Carnage. But basically, Normie Osborn is the son of Harry and the grandson of Norman. So Norman Osborn, as most of you guys know, is the Green Goblin, right? And the big moment he had over the course of his entire publishing career was throwing Gwen Stacy off the bridge. And in certain circles, there's still a debate that goes on over who actually killed Gwen Stacy. If it was the Green Goblin who killed her before Spider-Man got there, or if it was Spider-Man shooting his webbing into her foot and then like her neck snapped, right? Because it goes both ways. There's an actual onomatopoeia in the comic that says like snap, right? Like her neck snaps. And then in the same comic, the Green Goblin's like, I killed her before you got here. So there's fans that kind of go either way, and really kind of the argument rages still to this day. But following that, really like the next big moment, I would say, in the history of Green Goblin, like the really huge landmark kind of character shifting moment came during the events of Dark Reign, right? You come out of Secret Invasion, Tony Stark is kicked out as director of S.H.I.E.L.D. after the fact that, Skrulls have been replacing humans and various superheroes, and Tony Stark didn't know. And so he's replaced with Norman Osborn, who had a key piece of information that turned the tide of the Secret Invasion war that basically led to humanity winning. And so he dismantles S.H.I.E.L.D., he basically creates Hammer, and he goes forward doing villain things because he's a bad guy, and then tries to like basically conquer the United States and then eventually the world. Now, ultimately he's defeated, he's thrown in jail, and then along the way, the Green Goblin kind of bothers him a little bit, kind of harasses him, and then ultimately he recalls Hammer, makes his escape, and then he was kind of free floating after that. And then you go into basically the Red Goblin story, which is kind of an attempt to bring Norman Osborn back, but then modify him, right? So give him the Carnage symbiote and basically become a combination of the Green Goblin and the Carnage symbiote, which is basically Red Goblin. And it was a cool thing, but during that story, what he did is he actually kidnapped Normie and then basically, put a piece of the symbiote into Normie Osborn and then turn him into what was called Goblin Child. And it was kind of a cool little segment. It was a cool little thing. It didn't really last long enough to see where it went, just because of the fact that we were coming up on the end of Dan Slott's run, and that basically went into the new era of Spider-Man with Nick Spencer. But it was a cool little thing. It was a cool moment and a cool bit of storytelling. But that really Norman Osborn has just kind of been in Ravencroft ever since, right? Ever since the events of the Red Goblin story when he was defeated, he's just kind of been locked up and imprisoned. But that's why Normie Osborn is here, is because of the fact that he held the symbiote at one point, that codex is there. Now remember, the codex is really Donny Cates' way of explaining how it is that the Venom symbiote could leave Peter Parker and then go to Eddie Brock and then still remember everything about Peter Parker, right? It plants a little piece of itself, a little memory, a little tiny knowledge fragment, a little nugget of information, and Peter leaves it there, and it always happens from one host to the next. And so it's basically Carnage going around and trying to take each one of those individuals into himself and capture their codex by default. And so initially the idea of the maker is, well, if this kid's been exposed to the codex, then let's basically take a blood sample and see if we can't find a way to, find a weakness or what this codex means, and if we can use information there to take out Carnage. Of course, the response to Spider-Man is absolutely not. I'm not going to let some crazy guy who's an alternate reality version of Reed Richards take a blood sample off of my godson, because I don't know what this guy's going to do with it. If he's going to create like 1,000 clones of this kid, who knows? Like, this guy's kind of bonkers, and in reality, he's right. The maker is kind of crazy, but as a result of this, the maker's like, well, then fine, get me somebody else. Get me anybody else out there that you know of off the top of your head right now who's held the Venom or the Carnage symbiote, and then bring them here. And there's only one person that these two guys are aware of. There's only one individual that these two guys know that they could basically find, locate, bring them back, and then use that person as a means to achieve this goal. And we'll find out in the next video. Okay, so the power supply for my eGPU fried, my MacBook Pro had a hardware failure that I had to take it in and have it shipped off for repair. Everything's failing in my home right now. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we're covering part 3 of Absolute Carnage. In part 2, really parts 1 and part 2, because remember, the first issue split into 3 parts. The first 2 parts, it was basically panic mode, right? It was the idea that Cletus Cassidy had essentially returned. Now, the way that Donny Cates had written this is that Cletus Cassidy had been coming back for a while. It's just that right now, Eddie Brock just realized what was really happening, right? He just realized that like Cletus Cassidy's made his return. And I love the way that Donny Cates wrote that, right? Because for the person who's kind of getting into Carnage and doesn't really know anything about the character, it's like, cool, a new symbiote. For people who are familiar with Carnage, it's like, cool, an old symbiote, and a lot of people are going to die. But it's one of these things where kind of like your dedication and your sort of time spent with the character of Cletus Cassidy over the years is kind of rewarded, right? Because like this is the return. This is like the joke if the Joker got the Venom symbiote, right? Like a crazy person becomes Venom, and then like loses their minds. But the idea behind this is that we're basically dealing with them going and grabbing Norman Osborn. Now, we talked about this in the last video, and we'll kind of refresh it a little bit for those of you guys who are you know, kind of coming into this. So if you're watching the full story version of this, we'll kind of be repeating ourselves for a second. But the idea behind Norman Osborn becoming really the Red Goblin, right? The Carnage and the Goblin concept was to kind of try to reinvigorate Norman Osborn, right? To kind of like give him a new status quo after the events of Dark Reign. In reality, you don't really need to, right? There are some villains out there in the realm of comic books, the Joker, Lex Luthor, characters like Norman Osborn, who's probably, while he's not certainly the most iconic Spider-Man villain, I'd say he's probably the most important. And so what they did is Marvel basically said, let's give him the Carnage symbiote, and then in turn have him bring back the Green Goblin, so he basically becomes the Red Goblin. And it was really popular for a little while, right? Like it's one of the more popular stories involving the various symbiotes. I would say it's more popular because it involves a symbiote as opposed to just the Green Goblin himself. But again, he's a legacy villain, right? So it's one of those things you don't have to really change all that often. What you end up having here is Spider-Man and you have Venom, who basically race off to grab Norman Osborn. And this is kind of an important thing here, right? Because with Norman Osborn as the Red Goblin, I wouldn't say he pushed the symbiote to new heights by virtue of like his intelligence and so on and so forth. It was really more like merging with the Green Goblin and the Venom symbiote that kind of pushed it to new heights. But Norman Osborn is not an unintelligent guy. And the real question, the idea behind this is that with Venom really realizing what's going on, and this idea that Cletus Cassidy is running around and tracking these codexes, right? Like trying to kill the various individuals who have been symbiote hosts. The question is, we kind of have to save Norman Osborn. Now, it's interesting here because on the surface, you would say, well, then let him die, right? Like just let Norman Osborn die. And it's one of those funny things because it's really more of the moral quagmire of Venom and Spider-Man. What kind of superheroes would they be if they just let Norman Osborn die, right? I mean, that's kind of the issue that you run into here. What kind of heroes would they be if they let this guy die? And that was basically the end of it. And so again, it's kind of intriguing because in the midst of all this, suddenly you end up having Spider-Man who goes nuts. And this is one of the more important things that Donny Cates is doing here. Again, we talked about this in the first couple parts and it bears repeating here, but the idea is that in years past, right, going all the way back to like, even you go to like David Michelini's original like Venom Lethal Protector, but like you go all the way back to like when Carnage was first introduced, and even before that when Venom was introduced, and all the various symbiotes between them, right, like Scream and Riot and all those guys. The way this always worked, and it was kind of etched in stone by Venom, is that when a person becomes a host, the symbiote can leave, right? Like if by, you know, by whatever manner and whatever means, if the symbiote leaves, the symbiote takes memories of that person with them, right? So that was the case of Venom, knowing the identity of Peter Parker. The Venom symbiote had bonded to Peter, it was cast off in Web of Spider-Man 45, and then it bonded itself to Eddie Brock, taking the knowledge of Peter Parker's identity of Spider-Man with it. And so the reason why that's important is because what this does is it basically allows Donny Cates to build on that concept and say, actually what happens is for all those individuals who have been a host of the Carnage symbiote, it leaves back, or it leaves behind itself a kind of sample, right? Like a kind of little genetic code that the Carnage symbiote that Cletus Cassidy can tap into. Now, the big question to ask here, this is kind of the big thing to come out of this, can Venom do the same thing? Can they tap into and can they basically control the minds of other individuals by using that genetic code? One of the other big changes that Donny Cates is making here is Carnage's ability to spawn more symbiotes. What Cletus is doing here is basically creating these little mini pods, and then they're forcing themselves into various prisons, going into the bodies of those particular prisoners, and then basically creating more symbiotes, so to speak. Now, it's kind of interesting here because these aren't really Carnage symbiotes in the traditional sense, which is to say they're not really like duplicates of himself. They're really more akin to like children. And that's why this is cool, because if you look at this, it looks like you literally have Donny Cates building up this army of soldiers, more or less, for Carnage, who in turn can allow him to try to defeat Null, the symbiote god. That's kind of where I hope this is going to, that you end up having Carnage and Spider-Man and Venom all teaming up to face off against Null, and then like truly and successfully defeat him. Like, it'd be kind of cool, but it's kind of one of these funny things, because as that goes off, you know, as this begins to go down, you end up having, of course, the sound system that's triggered, and then with the sound system being triggered, as we know with symbiotes, they hate like loud sonic vibrations. And so where Eddie goes to take them out, it allows him and Peter to basically team up and try to face off against the forces of Carnage. But that's where things begin to go awry, because at the outset, you simply expect it to just be Cletus Cassidy, right? Like you expect it to just be him and go walking in, because the reality of this is that you go back and you look at like Maximum Carnage, the Maximum Carnage storyline, you go back and look at the time that like Eddie and Spider-Man first fought Venom before Maximum Carnage, and you're talking about a symbiote out there that's stronger than the two of them, right? So Cletus Cassidy alone would be enough to overtake and to basically defeat Spider-Man and Venom. And so this is designed to illustrate one or two things, or possibly both. The first is that it's designed to basically show that like all these different characters are designed to show up and basically cause absolute pandemonium, right? Like bolstering the numbers of Carnage's forces. The other half of this, and this is what I think is actually a little more interesting, is that Cletus Cassidy is getting arrogant. I can send my forces forward and have them do it for me. Now, in reality, if Cletus Cletus Cassidy is getting carried away with himself, and if he's being arrogant, then it's with good reason, because you basically have like all these different forces that are pretty much overtaking Venom and Spider-Man, and they're doing a pretty darn good job at it, right? I mean, that's kind of the nature of things, is you're talking about these exceedingly strong and powerful versions of Carnage, really like more of the Grindles than anything else. They're just kind of ripping things up. And so in the midst of all this, where Peter kind of gets, thrown to the side, he's met by the arrival of Cletus. And that's when things really get scary, right? Because Cletus is a man without reason. And that's what makes Cletus so dangerous, is because of the fact that he's a believer, right? He believes that what he's doing is right. He believes that what he's doing is the correct thing to do. And you can't sway him from that belief. He's a guy that just cannot be changed. And so what happens when you give a person who cannot be changed the power to force change onto other people? They're going to do exactly that. They're going to basically create a litany of reasons for why you're wrong and then force their entire perspective onto you, right? So either you can reject it or you can accept it, but you're not going to be able to get them to change what it is that they're doing. And that's what's so cool about this, is because you basically have like Venom fighting off against Peter, and it's one of these cool little moments, because when that happens, Venom actually sort of chastises Peter for a second and says, stop being clever, stop being funny, stop cracking jokes. This is time for business. And that's an important thing. But one of the things that Dan Slott established during the original Spider-Man Renew Your Vows as part of Secret Wars is there's a reason why Peter does this, but there's no reason to do it here. One of the big questions people had all the time for years and years and years, Peter would crack jokes in the middle of fights. And people always sort of attributed that to the fact that Peter was just a character who would joke around. But there's a reason for why Peter does this. So really, it took decades to get to the point where we could actually get an explanation to it. But during the original Renew Your Vows, Dan Slott stated that the reason why Peter does that is because it throws his enemy off, right? It frustrates his enemy and makes him angry because the enemy believes Peter doesn't respect them, right? Like, I'm not taking this fight seriously because you're not really anybody to worry about. This is business as usual, and you're of no real concern to me. That's the message Peter puts off, right? The other idea is to kind of keep things loose and to keep Peter from getting carried away, keep him from getting like super overexcited and to kind of keep him grounded and in the moment. But it's as much to like screw with the other guy. The issue with this is that with Cletus Cassidy, that don't work. That dog don't bark, right? Because Cletus Cassidy doesn't take the bait. That's the nature of it. Cletus Cassidy is about as crazy, or not really as crazy. He's crazier than Spider-Man. So like cracking jokes, going on about nonsense, it doesn't really work. And that's why Venom says it's not the time to be clever. It's not the time to be funny. It's not the time to like crack jokes and be your usual self. This is the time to be serious, because if we're not, we could die here today. And Peter knows that, but Venom doesn't know that Peter knows that. It's just Peter's way of doing things. This is kind of how Peter is. And so following this, the two of them are basically like knocked out of this cell, sent flying out into the hallway. And that's when Peter basically begs for Carnage not to kill Norman Osborn. And that's when he says, I'm not here to kill him. I'm here to add him to my forces. It's literally Carnage absorbing Norman Osborn into himself and basically turning Norman Osborn into one of his various henchmen. Now, Norman Osborn does not have the Grendel insignia on his forehead. And the indication here is that Norman Osborn is something wholly new. Like it may be that he's something wholly different and wholly new. Probably not. He's probably just like all the other ones, right? There's nothing really special about him. But I have a hard time believing Donny Cates wouldn't have him depicted in this manner if he wasn't different from everybody else. So I'm really excited. I'm really curious to see where it goes. Okay, so we are a little behind on Absolute Carnage. And you would think that we would be caught up, right? Like you think we would have it all caught up and everything, because I really love this event. But I took a vacation all last week except for like 2 days, and one of those audios was already just kind of out there. So now we're actually getting back into the thick of things, right? Like actually getting back into the meat and potatoes of recording. A lot of you guys are probably also wondering why I haven't done full story videos recently. I'm actually saving them towards the end of the year, and then I'm just going to kind of like do a month where I just dump a whole bunch of full story videos from what we've done so far, and just kind of go from there, right? So Absolute Carnage will probably come out in like November, and then there'll be like a few others here and there. So yes, Absolute Carnage Part 2. Okay, so what Donny Cates has basically written so far is this story where things are in dire straits, right? I mean, and here's the funny thing about Absolute Carnage is in this issue, and this really, technically it's the second issue, although it's like the fourth part more or less, it almost kind of feels like Spider-Verse meets like Carnage. I mean, we're not dealing with multiversal versions of Carnage, but it does feel like that insofar as anybody who's ever held a symbiote is basically being tracked down by Carnage and being consumed. Now, this is one of the things that I kind of wanted to toy with in the last video, and we kind of want to bring to light in this one, is that really Norman Osborn is not fully under the control of Carnage, right? And it's something that a few of you guys pointed out in the comments of the last video. For those individuals who were totally under the control of Carnage, they have that little spinny spiral thing on their face. For Norman Osborn, he doesn't have that. Now, why he doesn't have that is not explicitly given to us, right? Because looking at this off the top of our heads, what we've seen so far, those individuals who Carnage has consumed are under his control, right? But the individuals that we've seen him consume so far, at least in the first few issues, have just been those that he's basically taken a portion of himself and put it inside of them. So we don't really know, at least at the moment, at least at the time I'm making this video anyway, like, suspend your disbelief for a second. But the idea behind this is that it doesn't look like Norman Osborn is totally under the control of Carnage. And this is cool because it allows Norman Osborn to basically maintain himself, right? It allows him to kind of keep the personality that we've all kind of come to know and love over the years, the kind of rebellious guy, the guy that like, you can't tell me what to do, because what you basically have here by virtue of Cletus Cassidy and Carnage is you've got two roosters in the hen house. That's essentially what's going on, and one of them's gonna have to go. That's basically what's taking place here. Now, of course, for Spider-Man and Venom fighting off against these massive numbers of Carnage forces, there's no way they can win, right? And it would be a foolish measure to try and stay. It would be stupid. I mean, there really wouldn't be any sense in it, right? They're throwing away their life for something dumb if they were to stay here. Now, remember, Spider-Man does not know all the changes that have gone on with the Venom symbiote. He doesn't know everything that's happened here. And so this is important because for Eddie Brock himself, of course, having come into contact with Null basically sort of expanded the powers of his symbiote, which in turn granted him, of course, the power of flight by use of wings. Spider-Man doesn't know all this stuff, right? So he's kind of coming into this thinking, this is Venom as I've always known him. We're standing at the top of, like, Ravencroft Asylum. If we jump off, we're probably going to be dashed to pieces on the rocks. We're screwed. We're basically going to die. And it's cool because Eddie Brock basically flies them to safety. Now, this is where the Norman Osborn part begins to come in, because where you have, Norman Osborn asking the question, why aren't we going after them? The response he's being given by Cletus Cassidy is, well, because there's other people for us to go after. Now, this is kind of a cool thing because Norman Osborn's stance is, well, we got to take out Spider-Man and we got to take out Venom because they'll come back and they'll catch us later on. And in reality, he's not wrong. The funny thing about this is that they're actually looking at the same goal from two different perspectives, right? So like Norman Osborn is looking at this from the perspective of like what we saw with Dark Reign. Take out the heroes right off the bat, like get them out of there as fast as you can, and there'll be nobody to stand against you. Cletus Cassidy, on the other hand, seems a little more subversive, right? His stance is, we won't go after them. We'll just amass our forces to such a huge amount that we don't need to worry about them, right? So like when they come calling with whatever forces they have, it won't make a difference. It's cool in terms of how their approaches work because both of them have merit. Now, the problem with this comes when it's Venom and Spider-Man, kind of transitioning back to these characters again, when it's Venom and Spider-Man and it's what do we do next, right? Like where do we go from here? Because they're both in pretty dire straits, right? I mean, this is basically their worst nightmare, right? In a lot of different ways. It's the worst thing they could have seen happening. The most insane character they've ever come across, bonded to one of the most powerful symbiotes in existence, probably the most powerful short of Null, the symbiote god himself, is now running amok in the city of New York and marshaling his forces. It's pretty bad. It's pretty terrible. You're talking about a crazy guy. So he's leading the show. He's running the show here. And then he's creating a whole mess of people, like a whole army of people who can avoid Spider-Man's spider sense. It's the most horrifying thing ever because at any point Spider-Man could die and he'd be dead before he heard the sound that killed him. So it's one of these crazy scenarios. Now, for Eddie Brock himself, things are a little bit different. The cool aspect is that because of the fact, and this is really what Donny Cates seems to be going with, and it can kind of go two different directions, right? But Venom himself can kind of feel the forces of Carnage. It doesn't mean he knows he can pinpoint them exactly where they are, right? Like he's no Molly Walker from Heroes, but it's one of these things where he can kind of feel the fact that they're out there and they're kind of making their way towards him. So it almost kind of seems to be an empathic thing. How it is that he picks up on that again, it can kind of go a couple different ways. It can go by way of the fact that all these forces are being marshaled by a Grendel symbiote, which is kind of the precursor to the symbiote of Eddie Brock and of like the Venom symbiote and all that kind of stuff. We can kind of go that route, or we can go the route that I think is a little more interesting, is that basically Carnage is spawned directly from Venom. And so because Carnage is spawned directly from Venom, and because Carnage bonded with Cletus Cassidy on the blood level, even though he's using a Grendel symbiote, it kind of seems to carry over, and it allows Eddie Brock to basically feel the offspring of Cletus Cassidy in the form of all these different forces out there. So it's kind of a cool little moment here, but ultimately they end up settling on the idea that Spider-Man is essentially going to marshal the Avengers, right? Because remember, Spider-Man is an Avenger, and he has been since the New Avengers by Brian Michael Bendis. It's one of the things a lot of people tend to forget, that Spider-Man is kind of, he's out there and he does his own superhero thing, but unless you're reading an Avengers story that involves him being part of the team, it's easy to forget that he is a member of the team. The issue with the Avengers comics, as you usually see them, is that that they often focus on the core Avengers rosters, right? The ones who are there day in and day out. Now, again, it's kind of a cool little show by Donny Cates, because in this day and age, in the age of crossovers with Marvel, it's the one question a lot of people would ask is like, why doesn't Spider-Man get a hold of the Avengers, right? So like he nips that right in the bud. Like we'll call Captain America, we'll call Wolverine, those two guys specifically because they dealt with a Grendel symbiote in the past and they kind of know how to defeat them, or at least have a much better understanding of how to face off against them. The problem is that in the middle of all this, suddenly Eddie Brock basically gets a call from the Maker, Reed Richards from the Ultimate Universe. Now the idea here is that Reed, this version of Reed, the Maker, has kind of just been safeguarding Dylan, right? The son of Eddie Brock, albeit Dylan doesn't know. And so one of the funny things is that he, literally the Maker says, I've been combing through the FBI's database here, and like Anne Wei-Ying was not in the body in like the mass grave that was dug up, right? Like her corpse was never there. And that was a big concern of Eddie Brock, because remember, we talked about this in the last video, that Anne Wei-Ying was basically his ex-wife, more or less, right? I mean, it was one of these things where Donny Cates kind of threw it in there and said that she was pregnant with Eddie's child, and just we never knew. But it was one of those things where basically she was the Venom symbiote for a little while, and then eventually it drove her crazy. Eddie Brock drove her crazy. A whole bunch of things drove her insane, and she jumped off a building to her death, right? Like in between that time period, that's when Donny Cates came in and said, actually, she was pregnant with Eddie Brock's kid, and the result is that kid is here now. The issue with this is that if Anne Wei-Ying, having been a host for the Venom symbiote at one point, did not have a codex in her body, then the question is, who has it? And what the Maker says is she passed it off to Dylan. Now, this is a very important thing, because what this means is that a codex can leave a person and go to someone else. In reality, this is a way out for Donny Cates, because what he could do here is at the end of the story, he could basically say all the codices are now inside Carnage, and where Carnage would seek to rule as the right hand of Null the symbiote and kind of bring darkness to the universe, Null would kind of be like, no, and then just kill Cletus Cassidy, take everything and take all the codices to himself, and then, well, everybody would probably end up dying anyway because he would be returned to full power. But the fact remains that a codex can be passed from one person to the next. Now, we don't know if the codex is a physical thing. I mean, we know it's written into a person's DNA, but as we know, when it comes to offspring, it's not like a mom gives birth to a child and then all her blood goes into the child and all her DNA goes into the child and she loses everything about herself. It's more or less just kind of copying her DNA and the father's DNA into that baby, and then it's kind of a combination of both. And so this creates a really interesting scenario here, because normally you would look at that and you would say, well, the codex just kind of copied from her into Dylan, but instead it just went into Dylan entirely. So it's kind of a cool little revelation here. I mean, there's a lot you can extrapolate from these small little things. And that's why Donny Cates is such a great writer, because you can bring these small little bits and pieces into this stuff and just kind of throw it in there. Now, from here, of course, you basically deal with Eddie Brock facing off against like all these Carnage Grendel guys who are all running up on him. It's like as fast as they can. And so it's kind of, it's like a cool moment because it's like Venom's last stand. And so it's pretty badass. I really dig this, because here's the thing. Here's the thing. All right, Donny Cates' Venom is cool because the way he writes it, I feel like Donny Cates writing Venom is about the most awesome he's been in a few decades. And I say that understanding what it is that I'm saying, right? I mean, it's basically saying like Venom hasn't really been cool since Lethal Protector by David McElhinney. And I would kind of agree with that. I mean, there've been some cool moments, but Venom himself being cool, I don't think has really happened for a long time. And I'm talking about like when things like Scorpion, when Max Gargan was Venom and stuff like that. I mean, I guess fans of Flash Thompson of Agent Venom will probably get pissed off about that. I don't really care. I never really liked Agent Venom all that much. I was never a huge fan of him. Like, I mean, he was cool and it was a cool concept, but I'm old school. Eddie Brock all the way, right? Like, I dig Eddie Brock as Venom. And so Eddie Brock as Venom hasn't really been that cool because he hasn't really been Venom for a long time. But still, the fact remains, it's one of these awesome these little moments, because what it does is it switches over to Miles Morales and to Scorpion. Right now, again, Scorpion was a previous host for a Venom symbiote, which means that he's basically got the codex inside of him, right? I mean, Matt Gargan being Venom, that came during Dark Reign, right? He was one of the Dark Avengers, or at least one of the dark guys out there, right? Like the Dark Avengers with all the villains playing good guys, essentially. And so this was a cool thing because you end up having like Miles Morales holding his own against all these guys. Now, this is an important thing to talk about here, because for those individuals who are new to Miles Morales, they would look at that and they would still see him as like the new kid on the block. And in a lot of ways he is. In comparison to like how long Venom's been active and how long Spider-Man's been active and how long Cletus Cassidy has been active, he is kind of the new kid on the block, right? Even looking at like other Spider characters, right? Like Miguel O'Hara, Spider-Man 2099, looking at like Kane, looking at Ben Reilly, looking at a lot of those characters who are out there. Yeah, I mean they've been there and they've been there for a very, very long time. So really Miles is the new kid, but Miles has a lot of experience under his belt that really helps him catch up, right? The entire events of Spider-Verse, right? Fighting off against the Inheritors, Spider-Verse 2. I mean, there's all these cool moments, these cool storylines that he's been a part of where he's faced off against some pretty heavy hitters. So grabbing a lot of experience, rolling it under his belt, the entirety of Secret Wars by Jonathan Hickman, all the events that transpired in there. So he's grown up pretty fast and gain a pretty solid understanding of what he's capable of. And so again, using his shock, all that kind of cool stuff, facing off against these guys, he's able to hold his own to a degree, more than you would expect, which is kind of cool for little Miles. Like, go Miles! You got it, little buddy. Like, he's doing a great job. But of course, Matt Gargan tries to escape and Venom forces him back in again. The issue is that as soon as that happens, they're basically met by Carnage, who's like, okay, cool, snatch this guy up and drag him in. And I'm sorry, by actually, it looks like Norman Osborn, to be honest. He doesn't really have the thing on his head, but they basically end up snatching him up. And of course, they manage to impale him, but of course, he ends up getting away when Miles goes to attack. And this is one of the crappy things that goes on here, because what takes place is that where this is revealed to be Cletus Cassidy, and it is actually him going through and trying to capture Matt Gargan, we end up having him capture Miles Morales. And this is kind of a big moment because we haven't really seen him capture a Spider character yet. And so that's why it really seems to feel a lot like Spider-Verse, because it kind of seems to be moving in the realm of the Inheritors. The question to ask here is, what will Miles do in relation to beefing up the power of Carnage's forces? Like, will it kind of be spread all throughout them, or will it just beef up the power of Cletus Cassidy? How's all this going to work? The other thing to bear in mind here is that there's a lot of information that Miles has, a lot of places to get to, right? Like the spider folks out there, what was the multiversal Spider-Man team? I don't remember what they were called. Nobody read it, so Marvel canceled it, but I guess I'm not alone in that regard. But nonetheless, there's a lot of cool things that could come out of this, a lot of information that could be extrapolated and could be extracted by Cletus Cassidy from Miles Morales on how to defeat these various characters, on how to take all of them out. As far as I'm aware, Miles does not know that Eddie Brock has a son, Dylan. And so as far as we're aware, I mean, I know that Carnage kind of knows, but there's nothing to lead Carnage to know that Dylan is the one with the Codex, right? I mean, we don't really know that yet. I mean, I guess he's just kind of tracking him down inherently, but still, it's a cool moment, right? I mean, because what this does is it goes into the one shot of Miles Morales being taken over by Carnage. It's a cool moment. Like, the story's pretty solid. Like, I'm really digging it so far. Okay, so Absolute Carnage just keeps getting better and better. This story just keeps getting ridiculously good. It's absolutely insane. And what this one does is it gives us like one of the coolest moments ever in the history of Venom and all that good stuff. Now, initially this picks up after issue number 2. I'm still debating on whether or not I'm going to cover the tie-ins. I'm not 100% sure. That's one of the reasons why I'm doing this issue by issue, is because if we decide to cover the tie-ins, we can do that later on just by like, or at least after this is done, like covering that video and then throwing into the playlist and then just kind of being done with it. But it is cool because this comes in the aftermath of basically Carnage taking over Miles Morales. Now remember, Carnage is going after everybody who has in any form or fashion either come in contact with a symbiote, which grants them a codex, meaning that the symbiote leaves its DNA behind, or a person that he could add to his ranks in order to basically bolster his abilities and use them as a means to achieve his goal, right? So it's really kind of twofold. Technically, there wouldn't be a reason for him to grab Miles Morales, but Miles Morales is a spider person and very capable in his abilities. And so using him to his own ends, that allows him to basically go against Spider-Man and the rest of the superheroes a little more well-armed than he was before, instead of just relying on a huge amount of forces for him to use at his disposal. Now, in reality, like, for the most part, in comparison to Earth superheroes, numbers trumps powers almost all the time. The only exception you get with that are like characters who can like warp reality or who have powers that have a huge area of effect, right? A huge AoE. So like, if you're talking about somebody like Storm who can control like all the elements, well, the numbers don't really matter, right? Because she's just like, you get lightning and you get lightning and you get lightning. Everybody gets lightning, Whereas with someone like Iceman, he can just like freeze a ton of people at one point. But somebody like Wolverine has to kind of like hack and slash his way through each individual person, right? So like, numbers for the most part will trump people with huge amounts of abilities. That's why stories like this are always kind of intriguing. But Eddie Brock has to essentially leave Miles Morales behind, right? But this is kind of a funny thing, is because the symbiote sort of starts to turn. Now, this is what I love about Donny Cates' handling of the Venom symbiote, right? The fact that Donny Cates is sitting down and he's writing the symbiote in a way to where it's its own distinct character. This is why I say, I think Donny Cates' run on Venom will turn out to be one of the greatest runs on Venom ever written, right? I mean, because you look at it and it's like, okay, so you get these cool progressions, things like that, but the idea of Eddie Brock and the symbiote fighting against each other in the sense of the symbiote's just like, we need to kill as many of the forces of Carnage as we can, and that includes Norman Osborn. Eddie's response is, no, we can't kill him because it's not under his control, right? He's operating under what Carnage wants him to do, not what it is that he wants to do. And the response to Venom is, it doesn't matter. And that's kind of I kind of side with Venom on this one, right? I mean, I'm curious which side you go with, but I side with Venom on this one. Like, sure, he's not operating of his own accord, but it doesn't make him any less dangerous, right? It doesn't make him want to kill them any less, right? I mean, he's like, his desire is to kill them, like to take them over, incorporate them into the Carnage symbiote, and then to kind of expand their numbers, right? Like, knowing that he's not able to operate under his own accord, it doesn't matter, right? Like, he still wants to take them out. And so that's why it's kind of like, you do what you got to do, right? People who win wars are ones willing to do whatever it takes to win the war, not the ones who take the high ground, right? So it's kind of cool, right? Like, you got to fight fire with fire. The Allies against the Germans, for example, right? Like, both sides killed. And we saw how that worked out. So it's cool when it comes to this, because what ends up happening here is Eddie actually tries to turn his back on the Venom symbiote for a minute, because the symbiote goes and tries to kill Norman Osborn, and the response of Eddie is, you can't. Like, if you really want to kill them, fine, go on ahead and do it. Like, go on ahead. Like, I'm gonna go save somebody. Like, I'm gonna go be a hero. And this is interesting, because what it does is it pits the symbiote in a way to where it basically has its own moral struggle. And that's what I love about this, is because the symbiote is now as much of a person as Eddie Brock is, right? The symbiote's in a spot where it's like, okay, yes, like, Norman Osborn can operate of his own accord. Basically, he's doing what the Carnage symbiote tells him to, as part of the Grendel and all that kind of cool stuff. He's not operating of his own will. And yes, he still wants to kill us, but it's killing him the right thing to do. And ultimately, like, Venom settles on the fact that it does not believe it's the right thing to do, and in turn ends up rebonding to Eddie, grabbing Matt Gargan, grabbing Scorpion, whose spine was broken by the forces of Carnage, and then flees. Basically takes off and goes back to Rex Strickland's safe house, which is, of course, again, where Eddie Brock is operating out of. Now, again, remember, like, when this whole thing went down, basically Eddie Brock told Spider-Man to get out of there and, like, to go find the Avengers, right? To, like, bring the Avengers together. And so, of course, that's exactly what Spider-Man did. Now, of course, we get Wolverine and we get Captain America, two old school members of the New Avengers when Brian Michael Bendis wrote them. We also end up getting Ben Grimm, who, again, is a heavy hitter and is kind of what they need. And then we get the mind of Bruce Banner. And the reason why they need them, or why they need him, is because when it comes to human biology, for the most part, like, you do kind of have a hierarchy, right? I mean, you got Reed Richards, Valeria Richards, Dr. Doom at the top, who trade like the #1 spot depending on who's writing the story, and then you kind of start going down from there. But just because someone is like the third smartest person in the world does not mean they're overall the third smartest person. Reed is the smartest person in the world across the board. That's true. But when it comes down to like specializations, like Bruce Banner takes the cake when it comes to human biology, especially gamma radiation. And so he's the guy that kind of takes that stance. When it comes to technology, it's Tony Stark. Like it's these cool little things that you kind of see with these specialization of characters that can sort of lend themselves to telling a particular type of story. And that's what's been going on here, is that the science behind the Maker in terms of curing the son of Venom of his codex works, right? Like the codex is now gone from the son of Venom. I'm sorry, gone from not the son of Venom, gone from Normie, from the son of Norman Osborn. And so it basically, I'm sorry, the grandson of Norman Osborn. But it works for the purpose that it serves, because what it means is this technology can be used to basically cure all the various superheroes of their codices. Now, what it does is it removes one half of the reason why why Carnage would want to take them, right? I mean, if these various characters have been hosts of the Venom symbiote in some form or another, and a codices was left behind on them, then in turn, like, Carnage would want to take them in order to get that codex. With that codex being removed, now Carnage doesn't have a reason, at least as far as that goes, to take them. But the power and the knowledge of Captain America, the power of like Wolverine, the power of Ben Grimm would still serve as an asset, meaning Carnage could still take them if he chose. So again, like, there's still motivation there for him to basically capture these guys and snatch them up and run away. And so as a result of this, you basically end up having having these different guys kind of thrown into these tubes of sorts that are designed to basically remove this codex from them. Now, a really cool moment happens here, because when this takes place, Spider-Man walks up, starts talking to Eddie Brock, and it's a really sort of heart-to-heart conversation. And this is interesting, because what it shows is that there aren't really any hard feelings between Peter and Eddie Brock, right? And indeed, there really weren't. I mean, ultimately, it was Eddie that kind of came down to constantly tracking down and constantly wanting to take out Peter. But at the end of the day, it's one of these things where they're basically allies. And this is why stories like this are so cool, is because what it means is that going forward, Eddie Brock could become, and probably will be, a tried and true good guy, right? Like, I wouldn't be surprised if you started seeing Eddie Brock on more like Avengers stories, different things like that, because of how capable he is and because of the fact that he's essentially turning over a new leaf. The issue with this is that when Peter basically asks Eddie, are you going to tell Dylan about the fact that you're basically his father, that Eddie for an instant seems to not know, and then ponders it, and then in turn, the real Eddie comes running up out of nowhere. And he's like, dude, Peter, get away from that guy, only for us to find out this is not Eddie Brock. This is Carnage, and it is amazing. I love these twists and turns, man. Like, I love what Donny Cates is doing with this. Dude, Donny Cates, man, this guy, I swear to God, man, this guy's like right up here with Hickman for me. Like, the writing styles, totally different. The ability to create epic stuff, exactly the same. Like, it's amazing. Dude, Donny Cates, man, everything this guy writes is gold. Like, it's oh my God, it's incredibly nuts. Like, it's Donny Cates, kudos to you, man. I am digging what I'm loving what you're laying down, man. This is awesome. Because in turn, like, Carnage basically summons all of his forces in and starts attacking every single one of these guys. And the response of Venom is like, look, like I told you what would happen. I told you we had to take these guys out. I told you we had to kill them. And I told them what would happen if you were a half measure, if you didn't do what needed to be done in order to win. And that's ultimately the coolest thing about this, is it's like those who can't do what needs to be done in order to win lose. And that's just the way it is. It's always that way, right? Like, you know, it's cool to take the moral high ground, and it makes you feel good at the end of the day, but at the end of the day, you lose. And that's just the way it is. So I guess if you're okay with losing, then the moral high ground is fine. If you're not okay with losing, then do what it takes to win. And that's the response of Venom. If you're not willing to do what it takes, if you're not strong enough to do what it takes, then I will find someone who is. I will find someone who's strong enough to be able to take this threat head on and not have any reservation about killing the various forms of Carnage that are running around out there. And so in response to this, the Venom symbiote abandons Eddie Brock and bonds itself to Bruce Banner. Following that, like, Carnage is kind of like, I don't know who this loser is, whatever, who cares? Let's focus on the things that need to be focused on. But instead, he basically craps his pants when he comes face to face with what I think is probably one of the most cool characters that we've ever seen in the history of comics, Venom Hulk. Okay, for those of you guys who are watching this video and who are a fan of The Boys, you are going to see that video later on today. That one is like 3 or 4 issues. This one's a one-shot, so I'm having my editor work on this one first and then send The Boys out later on tonight. So don't worry, the uncensored version will be on Patreon today, and the censored version, of course, will be out on YouTube. So I haven't forgotten about you, not leaving you hanging. But in any event, so Absolute Carnage, the Immortal Hulk, this is a really, really cool story that goes into why it is that Venom merged with the Incredible Hulk, right? Because remember, when it comes to Venom merging with the Hulk, and really in more recent years, it's usually one of these things where you kind of give permission, right? Where it's kind of like, I'm willing to bond with you. And so when Venom successfully bonded to the Hulk, really kind of the background question was like, why did the Hulk let it happen? And what this does is it basically explains that, but it's actually Al Ewing building on some pretty big things here. It really goes into the notion of like the one below all and Null the symbiote god. And this is pretty significant and probably one of the biggest comics or one of the most important comics that's going to come out, right? So that's why, for those of you guys who are new to comics, when you come across a story that you like, it's always important to at least skim the tie-ins for different events that are going on. Because a lot of times, like, tie-ins for the events will be really, really big, right? I mean, we saw it with like Original Sin and Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers. You learn that Captain America was originally part of the Illuminati, and you had to know that if you were going to understand everything that came after, right? So just small little things like that, small little moments like that. This also actually kind of has a pretty big explanation that comes in it as well. But what it does is it initially picks up with Bruce Banner kind of in this dark room. Now, in reality, this is Bruce Banner inside of his own mind, which is something to kind of point out here. But it's cool the way this goes down because occasionally we see this in Marvel Comics. You see that like Bruce Banner is having like some kind of internal conflict, or he's having some sort of discussion with himself, like with the Incredible Hulk or something like that. And it's been depicted in different ways. I like the idea of him basically being in like a big black box, right? Because it's just sort of the inside and the darkness of Banner's mind. But of course, he's basically speaking to somebody off panel and simply saying, hey, look, like maybe we should talk about how I got here. And now initially I expected this to kind of be like a runover of everything we've seen with regards to Immortal Hulk so far, but we don't get that. And it's one of the great things about Al Ewing writing, right? Like Al Ewing does not usually retread water. If you see kind of a recap of something that happened before, it's because within that recap is something that you didn't know before. And so it's a really, really cool little thing here, because what it does is it picks up with the events between the Immortal Hulk, the issue that we last covered, and the issue before that, right? So like basically between its conclusion. And what we end up getting is, of course, Bruce Banner waking up in this hotel room out in California. For those of you guys who were following that story, when he comes to, there's a couple different things that we get here. The first thing he does is he talks to like the Venom symbiote, more or less, is who it is that he's addressing. And he simply says, like, when you bond to a host, you know everything the host knows, right? Like you're awake 100% of the time. When the host is sleeping, you're awake. When the host is awake, of course, you're awake, but you don't really forget anything. He says, with me as the Incredible Hulk, whenever the Incredible Hulk comes out or any version of the Hulk, I don't remember anything. I black out. Now that's kind of a really, really big explanation to offer here, because what it does is it basically shows Banner does not know what the Incredible Hulk does. And over the years in Marvel Comics, that's been kind of waxed and waned and played with by various writers, right? Like some writers will say, the Incredible Hulk always knows what Banner's doing, and Banner always knows what the Incredible Hulk does. And it can be a little bit frustrating, because what it does is it kind of creates a situation where you're kind of asking the question, if Banner doesn't know what the Incredible Hulk does, then why is it like 3 years ago in the story that was written by about the Incredible Hulk that Banner knew what the Hulk was doing when he was going about and engaging in his own actions? And it kind of works that way, right? Like if you go and you look at Worldbreaker Hulk, for example, Greg Pak really seemed to pitch the idea in such a way that the Incredible Hulk was able to reach that higher level of power because he and Banner were kind of in agreement with each other that the Illuminati have to pay for the suffering of everything that went on. You can also interpret it as Banner was never part of the equation. He had no idea what was happening, but Banner references the events of World War Hulk, and he references like some of the things he did, right? So it gets kind of crazy in terms of how all this sort of fits together. But the big takeaway is that at the moment right now in the Immortal Hulk stories, whenever the Hulk comes out, Banner blacks out and doesn't know what the Incredible Hulk was doing. And so following that, where he basically sits down and watches the news broadcast about the, that mass grave that was dug up at a military graveyard, what it does is it asks the question, is General Thunderbolt Ross a person who's been dug up, right? Has his body been taken? And so that was initially the kind of question that was asked here by Banner, and it was, if that's the case and Thunderbolt Ross's body isn't there anymore, then should I tell Betty Ross, right? Like the daughter of Thunderbolt Ross. The issue with this is that Betty in her Harpy form, really in her Red Hulk Harpy form, she's so far removed from the person that she was before. She can turn back into Betty, but she doesn't want to, right? She doesn't want to be that human part of herself. She's so far removed from the person that Banner knew that he doesn't know how she's going to react. And in fact, when he talked to Jackie McGee, the reporter that's there, that's kind of following everything that's going on and really sort of an ally of Banner and the Hulk at the moment, she says the same thing. You don't know how she's going to react. She could freak out and like destroy you, or she could want to know. There's no real way to know here, and you're really kind of taking a risk with regards to everything sort of popping off. And so as a result of that, when he basically spills the beans and tells her, he's kind of like, how long could it take you to get there? Like, do you want to know? And she says, well, it would take me 10 hours if I flew alone. With you, I don't know. It would take too long and we would be seen. So he basically says, fold me up, right? Essentially kill me, fold me up, and then like let me go. And when that happens, the Incredible Hulk will manifest, after some time, with the Incredible Hulk knowing what's going on, the Hulk will manifest. And when that happens, of course, my body will be healed because of the healing factor of the Hulk, and everything will be fine. And so ultimately they end up flying out to this place in North Jersey to find the body of Thunderbolt Ross being there. And it's kind of a crazy thing because you end up finding out that what the federal government had done is, as soon as this mass grave more or less was dug up, that Thunderbolt Ross's body was taken. And so it's kind of one of these things where it's like, is this body out there preparing to be used by someone? Are they going to resurrect him? And that's one of the things that Banner says, is that for those of us who are gamma mutates, we never really stay dead, right? Like we always usually end up coming back in some form or fashion. Now with the Incredible Hulk, it's easy and it makes sense. If somebody goes to shoot or kill the physical form of Bruce Banner, the Incredible Hulk will manifest in an instant, basically heal Banner from his wounds and then go on a rampage. But for other characters, they really always seem to kind of make some sort of return. Even if they lose their powers, they end up getting their powers back somewhere along the line. Now, it really is kind of Al Ewing kind of communicating with this, how like writers treat like gamma mutates, like they always come back. Some writer always brings them back somewhere along the line or something like that. But even within Marvel continuity, they always end up making their return. And so it's kind of a cool moment. It's kind of a cool little thing there, because following that, it is the Incredible Hulk saying, okay, if this is the case, then like we have to somehow figure out what's going on with Venom, like how Venom ties into this and all that kind of good stuff, right? And so when that happens, like when that goes on, when the Hulk is watching the police investigate the site, they say the reason why it was dug up is because there was basically a younger guy by the name of Angelo Fortunato, who we've talked about in our videos on all the versions of Carnage and Venom and so on, who ultimately had a Venom symbiote, right? So Venom, or at least Carnage or Venom or somebody hosting a symbiote is involved in this, which brings the Incredible Hulk to kind of confront and figure out what's going on. And so inside Bruce Banner's mind for a second, I want to talk about this. He's met by a couple personalities. The first one is the personality of Joe Fixit. And it's kind of cool to see a version of Bruce Banner in his Joe Fixit form, right? Because you never really see that. You never really see Banner when he's Joe Fixit, the Joe Fixit personality. All you ever really see is Grey Hulk. And it's cool to see like the human form of Grey Hulk, right? Like how does that personality manifest? And this is also kind of a big deal as well, because when you look at the versions of Bruce Banner and you look at the versions of the Incredible Hulk, all you really see is that you've got like Banner as a singular personality, and then like all the other personalities are Incredible Hulks. But inside the mind of Banner is basically a whole bunch of Banner personalities that can turn into their own versions of the Incredible Hulk. It's cool. It's a really, really cool bit of a revelation here. But seeing kind of like a version of Joe Fixit that looks like Banner is kind of awesome. It's a pretty cool little thing to show. Now, you've also got like the Incredible Hulk who shows up, kind of, offers his own little tidbit here. It's kind of like, it hurt like hell to get crumpled up like that. It's a small little thing, but ultimately, this journey of Banner, or I guess of Hulk and Banner, trying to figure out what's going on with Venom and how he ties into all this, leads them into confronting Spider-Man. Now, of course, this little segment of the story takes place during Absolute Carnage, when Spider-Man leaves Eddie Brock to go find the Avengers, right? For those of you guys who are following that story. And with Banner running into him and basically saying, hey, look, like, we need to have a conversation. Tell me about Venom. Tell me everything that you know about Venom. Basically, like Spider-Man kind of recaps Carnage, the events of Absolute Carnage, and says, like, essentially, Cletus Cassidy's back and all hell's breaking loose, and there's this guy, Null, the symbiote god. He's some kind of a cosmic Satan. And this immediately resonates with Banner. And this is when we start to get into what seems to be the relationship between Null, the symbiote god, and like the one below all. Because to refer to Null as a kind of cosmic Satan, for Spider-Man to do that, drives Banner to basically say, like, it makes me think of the one below all. Null, the symbiote god, is some kind of a facsimile, or is basically the one below all, but in a different form. And here's the thing, that's entirely possible. Take, for example, the character of the Fulcrum in Neil Gaiman's Sandman comics. I'm sorry, not Sandman, not Celestials, Eternals comic. There we go. The Fulcrum is this being that kind of resides at a bar, this sort of like where Celestials go when they basically die, like when they pass on. And the Fulcrum is this astronomically powerful being, but you don't know anything about him. The only real sort of indication you have is in those Eternal stories itself, where it's like he might be like an aspect of the one above all. And even then, it's just sort of guesswork, right? There's nothing that definitively says, here is what the Fulcrum is, and here, like the Fulcrum doesn't say like, oh, I'm just an aspect of the one above all, is basically all I am. Like I'm just kind of here to hang out. You never get that. It's just kind of left to believe that's the case. But like that happens, right? These cosmic beings, these super powerful entities create kind of like facsimiles of themselves or work through individuals. And that's how Banner sort of perceives this. In his mind, Null the Symbiote God, and this is entirely possible, Null the Symbiote God is either a being worked through by the one below all, or it is an aspect of the one below all. Null may be an aspect of the one below all, but it's autonomous. He can go out and do his own thing, he has his own motivations, but he possesses a fraction of the power of the one below all, or the one below all is working directly through him. It's saying like controlling him, that kind of a thing. But because of the relation between the two, the question is asked, like, how does all this tie together? And that's why Bruce Banner ended up allowing himself to be bonded with the Venom symbiote at the end of the most recent Absolute Carnage storyline, because Banner wants to know, are the one below all and Null the same thing? Are they two different beings? Is it coincidence? Is it really just Peter Parker ran off a name and Banner's reading too much into it? We don't know. But Al Ewing is really kind of teasing the idea that like they're somehow in cahoots or related to one another, or they're somehow the same being. And so it's a really cool thing, because what it does, if that's the case, then it could be a scenario where literally the one below all has all different kinds of facsimiles that are out there, all different kinds of versions of themselves that exist all throughout the entirety of the multiverse, right? Because if the one above all is the supreme creator, the top being of the multiverse, then the one below all would be like at the very bottom of it all. But like he's a multiversal entity as well. It's cool. And it's a really interesting idea, because it kind of goes forward like asking the question, how close are they? how involved are they? I'm excited to find out. Like I really want to know. It's a cool thing to tease, and I'm really excited to see the answer for it. Okay, so we are continuing our coverage on Weapons Plus. And here's a funny thing about this, right? Weapons Plus is probably the most important comic book that Marvel's releasing right now that no one's reading. And it's kind of a shame, because there's so much going on in this whole Weapons Plus comic. And here's my bet. I would bet all the money in my pockets to all the money in your pockets that this is all going to go towards the Marvel Cinematic Universe in some form or fashion. What other reason is there to release and basically revamp the entirety of Weapons Plus if it's not going to be incorporated into the Marvel Cinematic Universe? It doesn't really make any sense, right? Because nobody was really asking for it. And that's one of the things we talked about in the first video. Nobody was really asking for like a revamp of Weapons Plus. It just came out of nowhere. Now, Marvel could be doing it of their own volition, but I feel like this is going to be a Marvel Cinematic Universe kind of thing. But the idea behind this in the first Weapons Plus that we had talked about, and this is one of the things that kind of came out of this, is Weapons Plus was historically, it was kind of a weird thing, right? Like Weapons Plus was originally just a Wolverine thing, and that was really all it was. Then it turned into, with Grant Morrison's run, it turned into Weapon 1, which was Captain America, running all the way up to Weapon X, which is Wolverine, and that's when the official Weapons Plus program came to an end. Unofficially, it continued on, right? You got Deadpool, you got the Stepford Cuckoos with, that were basically clones of Emma Frost. You got all kinds of stuff that came after Wolverine. But the officially sanctioned Weapons Plus program, as it was operated as a joint venture between Canada and the CIA, was basically disbanded. Like it was essentially gone. And so the funny thing about this, and what this did, at least in the first video that we did, is it basically established that Weapons Plus was alive and well, right? Like it was keeping on. And the extent of it, we didn't know, and we still don't know. But the crazy thing about this is that what it does is it basically has like this Weapon V facility, right? And it's interesting, you could call it Weapon 5, and that really kind of seems to be the case. It sort of seems to be like a dual meaning between Weapon 5 and like Weapon Venom. But what it does here is it basically says, okay, essentially like during the events of Absolute Carnage, when, Cletus Cassidy and his various mini counterparts, more or less, were kind of terrorizing throughout the city of New York and attacking various places, that what Cletus Cassidy has also been doing is striking at the heart of these various facilities. Because remember, the overall theme behind Absolute Carnage is that Cletus Cassidy is going after anybody who's ever worn a symbiote, right? Because anybody who's ever worn a symbiote gets this kind of codex that's basically bonded to their genetic material. And in turn, Cletus Cassidy, in order to increase his strength to become this wildly powerful being for what seems to be the purpose of going toe to toe with Null the Symbiote God, all really seems to be rooted in this idea of gaining like these codices, right? These little codices that have been bonded to people. And so what ended up happening is somewhere along the line, he attacked this Weapon 5 facility. Now, what this does is it jumps directly to Clayton Cortez. Now, here's the thing about Clayton Cortez, right? I would say about a year ago, Greg Pak had this really cool idea that Marvel just kind of wasted. And the idea behind this was to essentially introduce something called Weapon H. Now, Weapon H was a cool idea. Like when it first popped up, it was a cool idea. But like I was considering covering it. The problem was I was looking at the entirety of the Marvel landscape at the time, and as soon as I saw that come out, my immediate thought was Marvel's not going to do anything with that. And the reason why is because what it ended up turning into was Marvel doing like this grand reshuffling, right? So it was like during like the old, Dan Slott Spider-Man run, when Peter Parker went back to being Spider-Man, and it lasted like 12 to 14 issues, and then we got Secret Wars. So it was like, okay, so Peter Parker's back, but none of it's going to matter because we're basically getting Secret Wars, so you're going to have to wait until Secret Wars is done to see what happens with all of this. Of course, then we end up getting all new, all different Amazing Spider-Man and so on. But, looking at this, I was like, okay, I've seen this a million times, right? Like some character is introduced basically at like the precipice of what's going to be like a huge reshuffling at Marvel, and usually Marvel ends up wasting them. And that's what they did here, right? They wasted Clayton Cortez. The idea behind this is that William Stryker had his own kind of Weapons Plus program going on, not tied into like the overarching Weapons Plus thing, but basically his own sort of Weapons Plus idea. And that was really predicated on the notion of we got to kill mutants, so we'll just use Weapons Plus technology in order to do it. And so what ended up happening is William Stryker gathered together the genetic material of essentially the entire X-Force team at the time, and then in turn had them all bonded to Clayton Cortez. Now there was Weapon Beta and then Weapon Alpha, or at least Weapon H Beta and then Weapon H Alpha, or whatever you want to call it, H Beta, H Alpha. It was kind of a weird thing. But the idea behind this is that Clayton Cortez is basically Weapon Alpha, Weapon H. He was the prime version. And this is a guy who essentially has adamantium bonded to his skeleton. He's got the Incredible Hulk concept, right? So it's not unlimited strength, but it is like an insane amount of strength. And then he's also got Wolverine's claws, right? So he's a merger between two of these characters, along with some other characters too, right? Like Domino, different things like that. And it's an amazing idea. Like it is a super cool idea, but Marvel being Marvel wasted it. I imagine as time goes on, he may become more prominent, but the reality is that Weapon H is largely just a Greg Pak concept. That's really all it is, right? It's just only Greg Pak's thing. And so as a result of this, it's kind of crazy. For those of you guys who are new to comics, I want to talk about this for a second. For those of you guys who are new to comics, Marvel Comics operates very similar to like the WWE from wrestling. You have a character who hits their peak, usually the championship belt, and then for the most part, they just kind of fall to the wayside to make room for the new guys. And that's basically what happened with Greg Pak. He's an incredible writer, an amazing writer, but the idea here is that he basically peaked, for lack of a better word, with his run on the Incredible Hulk. But because it was selling so well, Marvel's just kind of like, do your own thing, man. So he just sort of gets shuffled off to no man's land, but has total control over what he wants to do, right? So he's like Starlin with the Infinity Saga. But the idea here is that Clayton Cortez, some 6 minutes into this video, the idea is that Clayton Cortez ends up arriving back at his family home, or at least where his family's kind of residing at. Now, this is an important thing, and the reason why is because after he became Weapon H, and after he fought the Incredible Hulk, Wolverine, and then essentially left them and went to go do his own thing, he started going from Eagle Star facility to Eagle Star facility and essentially wiping out all the records of himself. Now, the reason why this matters is because Eagle Star was the group that Clayton was part of before he was forced into Weapon H. And Eagle Star was basically just kind of like this military contracting team, right? These guys who would just go out and take care of these various schemes. And that's actually where you end up getting into this little segment here, is that you end up in this scenario where Clayton's basically confronted with like his old boss, where it's like, we were supposed to wipe out that whole village, you didn't, so on and so forth. And essentially they're there to basically capture him. They're there to like to grab him and bring him in. And the reason for that comes by way of a guy named Dr. Andrew Breen. Now we'll talk about Andrew Breen here in a minute, because at the moment he's just kind of there, and he becomes more important as the story goes on, or at least once we get towards the end. But what he does is kind of give us this timeline of Weapons Plus. And this is a very important segment here. And the reason why is because in the first video it was kind of like, okay, here's the timeline of Weapons Plus based on what we know. And what this does is essentially clear all that up. And the cool thing about this is it really kind of goes back to what we originally talked about, right? This idea that what you had in the early days is you basically just kind of had this idea that existed out there, that Weapons Plus was basically the reason for the creation of Captain America. But the problem was that once Captain America was believed to have been dead, then the question became, what do we do next? And so that kind of went into what we talked about previously, where you had these weapons projects that were being created, Weapons 2 and 3 and 4 and so on and so forth. But the big thing was that in 1965, and this is what we kind of talked about in Absolute Carnage, has sort of been hinted of, but it really kind of gets consolidated here, which is pretty nice. But in 1965, essentially S.H.I.E.L.D., led by Nick Fury, along with a handful of others, ended up coming into contact with what was basically the Grendel. Now, of course, those of you guys who were following Donny Cates' run, and those of you guys who were following Absolute Carnage are aware of this. But for those of you guys who are not, the Grendel's kind of like this leftover remnant, more or less, of when Null, the symbiote god, was kind of rampaging throughout the universe, right? And so the idea was that it was essentially frozen on Earth and just kind of stuck there. This led into the concept of the Sim soldiers, right? So the idea of like Rex Strickland and so on and so forth over at Donny Cates' Venom run, as well as what we saw in the first Weapons Plus video. And this idea was that when, with this kind of culminating with Russia's Department X, which basically gave us like the Winter Soldier, it gave us the Red Room, which produced women like Black Widow, Natasha Romanoff, and so on and so forth. Because of the fact that Weapons Plus was for the most part only really focusing on Russia, when they came across the Grendel, what they realized was the threat this Grendel posed. And so as a result of that, what they ended up doing was basically extracting sections of the Grendel off, right? Like these small little bits here and there, which were essentially, the precursor to the Venom symbiote. And what they ended up doing was bonding it to guys like Rex Strickland, right? So this goes into that whole thing. Following that, what we end up learning here, and this is what we didn't know before, what we ended up learning here is that where it was previously believed that Weapons Plus, at least as part of it, being a kind of government sanctioned organization, was essentially gone, the reality is that's not the case. That Weapons Plus still appears to be a government sanctioned organization, albeit operating in like a super deep clandestine way. But characters like Anti-Venom, like Flash Thompson, he's a byproduct of Weapons Plus. What this is doing is basically grabbing the entire Venom mythos as it exists, both by way of what Donny Cates is doing, as well as people before him, with the introduction of like Flash Thompson as Agent Venom and so on and so forth, and is consolidating all of it down into a singular timeline. And that's a genius idea, because what this basically means is that every iteration of the Venom symbiote as it's appeared in Marvel Comics as part of any kind of military team or any kind of specialized operations team like Agent Venom has all been sanctioned and secretly controlled by the Weapons Plus organization. And this is cool. Like, this is really awesome, because from there, like, what it means is it literally kind of brings it all together, right? And that's one of the things that Marvel's been focusing on a lot recently. It's creating more cohesiveness. Not only that, what we also end up learning is that while Urquhart, who's basically the direct supervisor, or at least was the direct superior of Clayton Cortez when he was part of Eagle Star, while they had essentially gone underground and they still exist as a team, they're now simply referred to as like Mars Team, as opposed to like the Eagle Star group or anything like that. It's a way to kind of cast off the previous name and then sort of operate as kind of a Black Ops wet work team and essentially stay off the radar without anybody hitting them up for like contracts or anything along those lines. But the idea here is they were the ones that were originally at the Weapon V facility when Carnage first attacked in the beginning of the story, and then they basically made it out, by the skin of their teeth, but they're launching this attack yet again. And that's why they're bringing in Clayton Cortez, because Clayton Cortez is a heavy hitter, right? Like, he's a big hitter. And so that's when you kind of end up switching over to Cletus Cassidy, who's actually sitting at a bus stop. And the idea here is that Cletus Cassidy is ultimately drawn to these guys. And this is a cool little bit of a revelation here, right? Because this is one of the reasons why tie-ins can oftentimes really expand and make a story a lot more interesting. The Cletus Cassidy is traveling all over the world to find anybody who's ever hosted the Venom symbiote. And the fact that these former Eagle Star turned Mars Team guys are basically Sim soldiers, meaning that they're harnessing the power of the Grendel, means they all have codices. And so as a result of that, Carnage is going after them as well. And that's the cool thing, is it's not just about superpowered beings. And it's interesting to see, because when this bus comes cruising in, right, this bus comes flying in, Cletus Cassidy of course is on it, but he's killed everybody there. And this is one of the funny things that goes on, is because what this really shows is that in terms of the government's perception, or at least Weapons Plus's perception of Carnage and what it is that he's capable of now, they're painfully ill-equipped, right? They're painfully unprepared. And the reason why is because all they really know about what Carnage is capable of at the moment is what they've seen in the various footage from the Battle of New York, because they're not really there, as well as the existing knowledge they have when it comes to the symbiotes. But remember, the Grendels are cut above the rest. This is not just your regular Venom symbiote. These guys are really bred, and really the Grendel concept itself is really designed to be like this kind of uber symbiote, which of course serves the will of Null, the symbiote god. And so with Carnage walking around with this sort of power, and then in turn these Sim soldiers walking around with something akin to this power, their initial thought is, okay, so symbiotes are basically weak to sonic and fire, so we'll use that, neither of which work, right? I mean, neither of those bring him down, and Carnage just comes running out. And it makes sense, right? Like, the entirety of Absolute Carnage would be kind of a bust if it's just like, so all they need is fire. Okay, well then just go get Pyro from like the X-Men and just watch how fast he kills Carnage. Like Pyro shows up and he's like, somebody give me a lighter, or bring in like Ghost Rider or anybody who can manipulate any kind of hellfire, and they would totally destroy Carnage. And so it's cool to see that that's not the case. Instead, what you get here is this pretty knockdown, drag out fight between Weapon H and Carnage itself. And this, while it's not the grandiose thing ever, this is really Marvel just kind of proving a point and showing us where Carnage is. And the reason for that is because when you read the Absolute Carnage event itself and you see him face off against various characters, it is interesting, but you can kind of chalk that up to the nature of Carnage, right? There really isn't a whole lot that's happened there that's just like, okay, so just here's how far he is above everybody else. You haven't really seen a whole lot of that yet. And the reason why is because a lot of the conflict that you've seen has really been confined to like the spider-based and the venom-based characters, right? So it's been confined to like Miles Morales and to like Spider-Man and to Venom and things like that. But these are characters that while they are powerful in their own right, seeing Carnage face off against the Incredible Hulk was more of Carnage outwitting the Incredible Hulk as opposed to outfighting the strength of the Incredible Hulk. And so again, it's kind of cool in that regard. But what you're seeing here is a knockdown, drag-out fight between what's effectively the Incredible Hulk and Wolverine merged into a singular person and Carnage. Now again, there are limitations here, right? Clayton Cortez does not have infinite strength. It doesn't really go on that way. And then that's when you start getting to what's going on with Dr. Breen. And Dr. Breen, what he's been doing is that where he's been putting eye drops in his eyes. And the idea here is that he had some sort of, vision impairment or something along those lines, that he needed those for, hence the reason he was wearing glasses. The reality is that he's been dropping the Grindel into his eyes. And the reason why is because he said he wanted to see the world the way the Grindel does. And this is kind of a cool thing, because what it does is it basically says that like you've got the Grindel out there, this Grindel symbiote thing more or less is out there, and little pieces of it have been siphoned off over the years, and that's where the Sim soldiers come from. But essentially it sees the world in a different way insofar as it's governed by a singular ideology. And that's what Breen had picked up on. Breen had essentially gone insane. It's really what this is. Like he's absolutely lost his mind. But the idea here is that all he sees when he puts, has the Grindel in his eyes is God is coming, right? Like God is on his way here. Everybody's basically going to die. And it's essentially all kind of pointing to this notion that Null the symbiote God is going to return, which makes the most sense. It's really the direction everything's going in. And Absolute Carnage would kind of be a bust if like Null never returned, right? If it was just like, no, he's not coming back, he's just been dead this whole time, that'd be kind of a bust, right? It'd be kind of disappointing. And so it's cool to see that kind of thing showing back up here. The result of this is that because of the fact that Clayton Cortez had never actually worn a symbiote itself, and because Clayton Cortez doesn't really care, right? He's kind of out doing his own thing. He ultimately just ends up leaving Mars Team to itself, right? He's just kind of like, whatever, I'm gonna leave. And he ends up taking somebody with him and basically bailing out. And that's basically it, right? Like he grabs the stepmom and they end up leaving. It's kind of a funny thing because the stepmom hates him, but to see them kind of reconcile is interesting. But that only really matters if you're reading Weapon H, right? If you're not reading Weapon H, none of that really matters to you. It's not really relevant to you. The idea and kind of the big takeaway that seems to be coming out of this is Weapon H, it looks like Clayton may end up joining the Avengers, but that's the nature of it, right? The nature of this is that this guy's trying to go out and do his own thing and doesn't really want to be bothered with the rest of the world. He kind of wants to just stay off the radar and stay hidden. And so it would make perfect sense if he didn't, if it was just like him fighting Carnage, which is kind of a cool little thing. In reality, if that's the case, all this is really designed to do by Marvel is to get, him out more into the public eye and get people to read his comics more. But it is a cool concept, right? Because this entire conflict was basically being monitored by Weapons Plus. They were watching this whole thing go down. And ultimately, Weapons Plus sees it. It's just an interesting concept. But at the end of the day, they're like, we've got other things we want to worry about, namely Weapon 30, right? Like Weapon XXX. And this is kind of a cool thing because it's like, okay, so like what other weapons are they focusing on? But the overall gist behind this is that it still continues the kind of mystery behind the idea of Weapons Plus. It continues the mystery behind what's going on with it and how all that's kind of unfolding. Here's kind of a cool thing here is this guy, this person who's overseeing it is actually just drinking from a Captain America mug, right? And it's kind of a cool thing because while you do have one of his guys off to the side who's basically reporting to him, my question, and this would be really, really awesome here, if it turned out to be evil Steve Rogers from like Secret Empire, that would be amazing. It'd be like this amazing revelation where he's basically rebranding and reworking and running the entirety of Weapons Plus behind the scenes. I would love that. Okay, so I still have a head cold, right? My throat is sore and I've got a whole roll of toilet paper. All right, basically my tissue paper to blow my nose. I've got my Vaseline to keep my nose from drying out. You can't stop greatness, son. We are picking back up again with Absolute Carnage. Now, here's the thing, right? Like the last thing we picked up with this, like the Incredible Hulk became the new host for Venom, which was cool. It's really, really awesome to see. Like I definitely dug seeing that. The issue was that it just ended with the Incredible Hulk becoming Venom. So we had no idea what he was capable of. We had no idea what it was that he could do. And the reality of this is we get to see this play out in the next issue, like in this particular issue of Absolute Carnage. But here's the thing about Absolute Carnage. As much as the story is titled Absolute Carnage, it's about Absolute Carnage in so much as he's just the villain who's there. The story's about Eddie Brock. And that's what I really dig about this, right? I mean, of course it has Carnage and of course he's the main villain and you do get to see like a really good display of his character in terms of how he's handled by Donny Cates. But in reality, I'm not really seeing anything here from Carnage that I haven't seen before. What I like is the evolution of Eddie Brock, and nothing really shows it better than this moment that he has with Peter Parker as soon as it all goes down, right? Because with Eddie losing the Venom symbiote, he's just a guy now, and there's nothing he could do to stop Carnage. I mean, he's hopelessly outmatched against Carnage, and even with Venom, he was still struggling, right? So what little hope he had was basically gone here.
Peter Parker himself, the best he can do is bob and weave and dodge Carnage, right? Like using his spider sense to try to get the upper hand, but he can't outright defeat Carnage because of how powerful he is now, right? So, but the cool thing about this is that what you end up having is a really cool, it's actually a really great reference here. What ends up happening is Donny Cates references the Jury. Now the Jury, dude, this is an organization I haven't heard of in decades, right? In a long time. The Jury was an organization created by David Michelinie and Mark Bagley back in Venom Lethal Protector #2 in 1993 or whenever it was that story came out. And the Jury was actually kind of like this anti-Venom task force is really what it was, right? So the idea behind this was that you had a guy named Orwell Taylor. I think it was Orwell Taylor. Anyway, he was a general in the military. His son was a prison guard, and he was actually a prison guard at an institution that was essentially the Raft before the Raft. It was for supervillains, essentially. And Venom made his escape, and Hugh died in the process. And as a result of that, Orwell ended up gathering together all of Hugh's friends and creating a task force to track down and try to destroy Venom. It didn't succeed, but it was a really cool concept. And the fact that like Donny Cates is gonna reach back to like 1993 and say remnants of this group are still around, it's cool. And here's the reason why it's so cool. Here's the reason why this matters, is because what it does is it creates cohesiveness. And cohesiveness is something that oftentimes is lost when it comes to writers crafting stories, especially events that focus on a character that they're taking over, because so much emphasis is put on how they perceive the character that oftentimes like old school stuff is lost. And so it's really cool to see a writer kind of say, hey, look, like remnants of this old school stuff is important here, right? Like it's a significant thing. It matters. It's awesome to see these throwbacks. It's awesome to see these really cool moments where it kind of hits back and harkens back to the old school stories. Now, the other cool thing here, and this is why I say like Donny Cates' handling of Eddie Brock, I think is second to none. This is the single best handling of Eddie Brock that we've ever seen in Marvel Comics. And the reason why is because he sits down and he talks with Peter and he says, I can't protect these guys. I can't do it on my own. Like as a singular guy, I can't do it on my own. And right now it's just you and me, and somebody's got to protect the boys. Somebody's got to keep them safe. That's your job. You stay here, you keep them safe. I'm going to grab some of this Jury tech. I'm going to go out there and I'm going to fight off Carnage's doppelganger forces as best I can. This is awesome because one of the cool things that comes out of this is literally like Eddie Brock gets out there and he's just like, all I hear is the screaming of these Carnage things, but it's almost a little bit of like a reprieve, right? It's almost kind of like Zen-like and peaceful, because he's like, the one thing I don't hear is a voice in my head. I don't hear Venom telling me what to do. I don't hear Venom giving me orders, telling me, Eddie, don't do that. Eddie, you have to run. Like, I don't hear that. It's just me. And he's like, I'm Eddie Brock. Like, I can be a hero. I'm a good guy. And by God, if I'm going to go down today, I'm going to go down swinging. Dude, it's one of the coolest moments of his character, like ever in the history of like Eddie Brock. Dude, it's so beast, because what you're talking about here is you're talking about a guy who's basically gone from like an arch enemy of Peter Parker who wanted to kill him to a guy who's now putting the life of his son in the hands of Peter to keep it safe, and is going to put his life on the line, and knowing full well he might die, get out there and take as many of these Carnage guys down with him as he possibly can. It's a wholesale revamp of Eddie Brock, and that's why I love it so much. That's why it's so awesome, because it's a total reformation of a character who in reality had this coming a long time ago. Like this really should have happened a long time ago, but it's cool to see it happen now. Now, the big question a lot of people had is, how would the Incredible Hulk with the Venom symbiote fare against Carnage? First things first, the Incredible Hulk looks amazing as Venom, right? Like, dude, he looks so beast, and I definitely want to see it make its return. But here's the thing about the Incredible Hulk, all right? We're not talking about like Doc Green Hulk, right? Like the super genius version of the Incredible Hulk. We're talking about what's essentially the Immortal Hulk, assuming that this falls in line with what's going on with Al Ewing's Immortal Hulk run. This is not the sharpest tool in the shed. Immortal Hulk and Savage Hulk, they're like forces of nature, just like punching and pummeling things, but they're by no means the sharpest tool in the shed. Battle tactics, strategies, these things are lost on the Incredible Hulk in his most pure, savage, and current immortal form. And it's kind of a cool thing to see, because when you end up having Cletus Cassidy, who's been around the block more than a few times and is by no means Captain America, but is by every means more capable than your average superhero, he gets the one-up on him like that in the blink of an eye. And it would be really easy to look at that and say, what a waste, like what a huge colossal waste. But I would say this is really designed to highlight just how capable Carnage is. That even when you have one of the most powerful beings in the Marvel Universe and just sheer physical strength, who puts on a symbiote which amplifies his power even further and still gets taken over by Carnage, it's a sight to behold. It's just like, wow, because what it does is it illustrates the gravity of the situation, and it says, what hope do they have? And all this really begins to come by way of Eddie Brock himself. And the reason why is because using one of the devices that belonged to the Jury, which I believe, it wasn't the Shocker, I can't remember which one it belonged to, but it's one that emits an electric pulse. What he does is he channels it through Captain America's shield. Now, people who are knowledgeable about Captain America's shield will say, okay, so Captain America's shield is a proto-adamantium / vibranium iron alloy that was created by Myron McClane accidentally, right? Attempts to duplicate Captain America's shield is what led to the creation of pure adamantium, the adamantium that's bonded to Wolverine's skeleton. And so because it's a vibranium alloy, technically speaking, it should basically absorb the electric shock, right? I mean, it could absorb kinetic energy, almost all different forms of energy. It should basically absorb that. But you would look at that and you would say either the shield would absorb it, but it wouldn't like electrocute Miles Morales. At least it's not something that we're familiar with. The answer to that question is actually yes, it can. And the reason why is if you go back and you look at Captain America Comics number 78, 1954, I love being able to pull out little nuggets like this because I feel like people are just like, what? Holy cow, how did this guy know about this? In Captain America Comics number 78, 1954, there was a character who was created called the Electro Monster or something like that. Marvel would reuse the concept later on when they introduced Electro in the Spider-Man comics, but this was a character who was created by the Russians for the purpose of like defeating Captain America. Now, Ed Brubaker's run, all that kind of stuff, not really Steve Rogers, doesn't really matter. The fact remains, when they go and they fire this electric shock at Captain America's shield, what Captain America ends up doing is absorbing it and amplifying it back. Now, we can kind of go with that or we can ignore it. And the reason why is because if you read Ed Brubaker's run on Captain America, basically every version of the character that we saw after the end of World War II was not really Steve Rogers and it was not really Captain America's shield. They were frozen in ice, basically. We found that out in Avengers number 4. So you can ignore it or you can go with it. You can say, well, at the time the story was written, it was Captain America, it was Captain America's shield. It wasn't until we got into the mid-2000s when Ed Brubaker changed all that. So you can do whatever you want with it. You know, you can ignore it or you can choose to go with it. I like the idea of going with it because I think it kind of makes the scene make sense a little bit more. Or you can just say the electricity passed through the shield and it shocked Miles Morales. Doesn't really matter. Regardless of the scenario, because electricity, fire, things like that are weaknesses to symbiotes, and because of the fact that Miles Morales had previously used his Venom Blast to kind of jog Eddie Brock out of being controlled by Carnage, this is basically Eddie Brock recalling that and then using it on Miles and then bringing Miles back. But this is a huge moment because we would look at this and we would say, okay, cool, one more ally to his side, now they have a chance. Miles is just like, dude, we're so screwed. And when the question is like, why? It's like, because literally like the Incredible Hulk taking the Venom symbiote, or at least the Venom symbiote bonding itself to the Incredible Hulk, and then it fighting against Carnage, the Incredible Hulk doesn't have the wherewithal to intellectually overcome Cletus Cassidy. Physically, yes, but all Cletus has to do is outthink him, and that's exactly what happens. When that time comes, Cletus Cassidy is gonna seize control of the Venom symbiote, and when he does, the Venom symbiote's gonna rebond itself to Cletus, and it's gonna amplify his power even more, because each time he takes a codex, he becomes more powerful. And so it's just kind of like, okay, so like literally at that moment, Cletus Cassidy strips the Venom symbiote off of Bruce Banner when he like forces the Incredible Hulk to revert back to Bruce, strips the Venom symbiote off of him, amplifies his power even more, and then essentially he's just kind of like, no one can stop me now. And for the most part, they can't, right? Like by that point, with the 10-minute window that was bought by Eddie Brock in order to basically allow the superheroes to wake up from their codexes being removed, they jump in as best they can, but they're no match for Cletus Cassidy. I mean, he takes them out with a quickness. Not only that, what we end up learning from Miles is that we're the maker, the Ultimate Universe version of Reed Richards at the beginning of the story, who was basically, you know, who claimed that he was extracting these codices and then destroying them, wasn't doing that. He was actually saving them. He was basically putting them in this great big huge storage device, more or less. And so the result is that like all these codices are there. All Carnage would have to do is break into it. And so the result is that like by all standards of measurement, Cletus Cassidy has more or less won. But what ends up happening here is Eddie Brock seems to make the sacrifice to say, okay, fine, if that's the case, if that's where all the codices are, then let's go get them. And so Eddie Brock, in like this amazing heroic moment, like he's literally going through and saying all this. He's like under all the noise and under all the chaos and under all the panic and under all like the fear and all this rage and everything that's going on, like under all of that, I can feel something that I haven't felt in a long time. I can feel hope. And so what he does is he literally breaks into this entire storage facility and basically absorbs all these codices into himself. And when he does, it amplifies his power up higher than it was when he was originally Venom. And then from that point, he basically goes forward and ends up chasing after Cletus Cassidy, at which point the story ends. Okay, so we are a couple weeks behind, but we are finally getting into the conclusion of Absolute Carnage. I feel like every comic book YouTuber in the world besides me has covered this. It's all good. So here's the thing about Absolute Carnage, right? This gives us the conclusion to the entirety of the event, but it's actually done in a really interesting way and in a way that has kind of been the source of debate among fans. And you guys will see why here in a little bit. But what it does is it picks up hot off the heels on the last one. Insofar that we kind of have this massive fight that takes place between Venom and Carnage. Now, Donny Cates had kind of built this, or really kind of built this up in a couple different ways. The first is that either it could be like this massive fight and this final fight between the two, or it could be the next in a long line.
line of fights. Regardless of how you choose to interpret it though, the big takeaway from all this is that it's really just Eddie Brock fighting for more than just himself. And that's one of the reasons why I've always said Absolute Carnage is not really the story of Cletus Cassidy trying to awaken Null the symbiote god, right? I mean, it is to a degree, but it's the rise and fall of, or I guess the return and rise of Eddie Brock, right? Like Eddie Brock kind of coming back and being like this amazing hero as opposed to like this villain that we've seen him be over the course of his time in Marvel Comics. Now, the big thing is to remember, Cletus Cassidy's strength is not what it used to be, right? I mean, he's much, much stronger now than he was before. And it's a pretty huge leap. Combine this with the fact that there are all these forces that he has at his disposal that are basically going through and tearing apart all the superheroes, and things pop off pretty fast. But remember, what makes Cletus Cassidy so dangerous here isn't so much the fact that he has the Carnage symbiote, it's how he uses it and how he manipulates people. And that's why I say I love this version of Cletus under Donny Cates, because he uses mind games to mess with Eddie Brock, right? Like when he's sitting there talking to him like, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to take the codices that you have off of you, and then I'm going to basically awaken Null, and I'm going to grind this world to a red mist. Like, I'm going to kill everything you know and love. And where Eddie Brock really chimes back in and says like, I don't want to hear this, I don't care, like for once in your life, shut up, I'm tired of hearing you go on about all this nonsense. At the end of the day, Cletus just keeps talking. And that's what makes him so interesting, is because he's a guy whereby he messes with your head as much as he does when he's fighting. It's very Deadpool-esque, very Spider-Man-esque. And that's one of the things that makes characters like that so dangerous when it comes to facing off against them in Marvel Comics, is because you're not just fighting them in a straight up battle, they're messing with your head. And it's one of the things that we've seen over and over again. Like, take Spider-Man as a really good example. It's one of the things we've seen over and over again, and we never really got a full-on explanation as to why, until we ended up getting Renew Your Vows by Dan Slott as part of Secret Wars, when basically Spider-Man revealed that he does that because it throws his enemies off kilter. They let their emotions get the better of them. And so it's kind of a cool thing here. It's a really good way for Cletus Cassidy to kind of be elevated beyond just like this answer to the question, what if Joker became Venom? And instead turns into like, what if he really becomes like this super dangerous guy? Now, the superheroes do get some help in the form of like Carol Danvers and Scream and Iron Fist and a handful of others who were all basically teleported there by Cloak. But these guys are, if anything, just a stopgap measure. At the same time that's going on, you've got Spider-Man basically protecting Normie Osborn as well as Dylan, and it's really all he can do, right? I mean, he's holding his own as best he can, and ultimately he ends up passing out because of the strain of the conflict. This all seems to kind of point to the idea that everybody's being overwhelmed all along the way. But something to point out here and something to notice here is that Eddie Brock, while he really kind of makes this claim of like, I'm not getting baited into your, thing, and I'm not getting emotionally caught up, he is, because he's totally swept up in his fight with Carnage and isn't really thinking about the fact that like Dylan's out there by himself. Spider-Man won't be able to last forever. I need to go back there and save my son instead. He's totally immersed in this fight with Carnage. So again, really bringing out the human element of Eddie Brock. The funny thing about this is that Dylan doesn't need protection, because when the various forces of Carnage start closing in, suddenly Dylan sticks his hand out and just eradicates one of them. And Dylan doesn't even know how that happened, right? Dylan just passes out. And so it's a cool thing, because we've never seen anybody do that before who didn't have some kind of telekinetic, telepathic, or even, either minor or expansive reality warping powers. The ability to manipulate biological matter is not something that you see every day. And the ability to destroy a symbiote in that regard is actually pretty intriguing. The only time we've seen somebody do that is Null the symbiote god. It's a pretty big development here, albeit we don't know exactly how this is going to go. Now, one of the cooler things about this comes into play when the fight basically makes its way back to the doorstep of Dylan after he kind of wakes up after passing out, or at least seems to, and Cletus Cassidy finally reveals his move. And this is absolutely genius, because what it does is it basically seems to engineer a situation where Cletus Cassidy wins, right? The idea of Cletus was to gather all the codices together and then in turn awaken Null the symbiote god, let Null do his thing, and just be there as the entire world metaphorically burns, right? That was the idea of Cletus Cassidy, to inflict as much death and destruction as he possibly can, and to awaken Null to make that happen. When Eddie Brock shows up here, I guess when the fight ends up coming back here, Cletus Cassidy basically says, here's how this is going to go down, right? Like, you've absorbed all these codices that are out there, the ones that I couldn't get my hands on. You took those, you've put them all in one centralized location. So here, only one of two things is going to happen. Either you kill me, you take your symbiote back, mine comes with it, you reconnect to the hive, and you wake up Null, or I kill you and I kill Dylan, and then in turn I reconnect and I possibly wake up Null, right? Like, the idea is that if Eddie kills Carnage and Eddie succeeds in doing that and takes his symbiote back, that ultimately he's going to wake up Null. Whereas if he lets Carnage win and he basically sacrifices Dylan, that there's a chance that won't happen, right? Because Eddie's got all those codices to himself. He could just like leave Earth, right? Jump into some spaceship and take off, leave Earth, and then Null will never wake up. And it's kind of a funny thing, right? But it's a gamble in that instance, happens. And so it's really intriguing because in response to this, Eddie kind of picks up on the fact that this is what you wanted, but then he basically says, fine, if that's how you want to be, then I don't care. Like, what I care about is my son. I care about trying to keep him alive. I don't care about anything else. And this is cool because this is really like Donny Cates kind of putting us in the mindset of like a parent, right? Like, what parent wouldn't let the world burn in order to save the life of their kid, right? I mean, if you were a parent who was not willing to sacrifice the world in order to save the life of your kid, I would argue you're no measure of a parent at all. And that's the cool thing about this, is because Eddie's willing to do whatever it takes in order to save Dylan. The irony of all this is that if Eddie does kill Carnage and he does take the symbiote back and it does wake up Null, then by all standards of measurement, from what Cletus Cassidy's saying, assuming that what he's saying is to be believed, that Dylan's gonna die anyway, right? Because nobody can stop Null because he's just so powerful. But at the end of it, Eddie doesn't care, and he does one of the coolest things ever. He literally pulls off part of the Carnage, or part of the symbiote, creates a sword, cuts Cletus Cassidy in half, reabsorbs the symbiote unto himself, and then in turn, everybody else is essentially cured, right? Like Cletus Cassidy appears to die when it's just his skeleton falls down. The symbiote is absorbed back into Eddie Brock, and the symbiote immediately starts talking to Eddie and says, dude, what have you done? You've literally doomed the world. Like, you're reconnecting to the hive. I can hear everybody now. I can hear all the other symbiotes that are out there. Null the symbiote god has woken up. Like, you just woke up Null the symbiote god. In effect, Eddie Brock just doomed the world, and Null is on his way to Earth. And it's the coolest thing because what it does is it sets up the next event that comes after this. And it's a really, really cool revelation, because the funny thing is that in that whole attack with Cletus Cassidy, like, Eddie Brock basically shouts like, I'm not going to let you kill my son. And then of course he kills Cletus. And so when it all really begins to kind of settle down and Spider-Man goes off to do his own thing, basically Eddie's left with Dylan, and Dylan's question is, did you say I was your son? And so what this does is it switches over to Venom number 20. And this is a really, really cool thing here, because you would expect this to focus largely on Eddie Brock, but in fact it doesn't. What it does is it focuses largely on the maker, right? On the Ultimate Universe version of Reed Richards, probably in one of the coolest ways ever, because the way this goes down is this Ultimate Reed was watching the events unfold in Absolute Carnage and is talking to some people that we can't see that are basically off panel. And it's the coolest thing ever, because what they basically say is like, what's going on with this kid? Like how does all this unfold? And basically the Reed kind of begins to hypothesize. Now, this is the important thing here, is this is a possible explanation. It's not definitive. Ultimate Reed essentially says that as far as he's aware and the best that he can tell, that Dylan is not really human, that instead Dylan is basically a living symbiote, is essentially what he is, right? Like he's what would happen if the Carnage symbiote, or if like the Venom symbiote, or any one of those essentially was born and then took on a human form and then went forward into the world. And the question becomes, how could this happen, right? If that's the case, how could this happen? Now, one thing I do want to sidetrack here for a second, this is huge. This is absolutely massive. We've never seen an instance where anybody's ever done anything like this before, right? The maker's argument here is that the Venom symbiote is unique among its kind, that the Venom symbiote isn't really like all the other symbiotes that exist out there because of his experience with humanity and because of all the things that it's been through. He then capitalizes on that and says, look at all the times where the symbiotes have popped up. The symbiotes have popped up at a time when there was a massive crisis that threatened the universe or the Earth or whatever the case was, but the symbiotes had to basically respond by bolstering their numbers. That's why you always saw symbiotes popping up whenever there was a major event taking place in Marvel Comics. And it's a cool little thing there, because the response and the question of Reed is, if the situation was so incredibly dire that the symbiote basically sat down and said, okay, so it seems like we always kind of spawn randomly, but instead we need someone that's particularly special, right? We don't need like just another symbiote out there bonding itself to a person. We need someone that's a cut above all the rest. Then it basically means the situation is that dire. And if the situation is that dire, then what could possibly be coming after Earth that the symbiotes would manifest and respawn in such a way that's wholly unique and has never happened before, to create a kind of symbiote super soldier, more or less, in the form of Dylan. And that's really where Reed doesn't really know that like Null is coming back to Earth, this ultra powerful multiversal being. Basically, it's kind of a cool little thing that goes on there. And so what you end up getting is this super heartfelt moment. See, this is why I love Venom by Donny Cates so much. You get this super heartfelt moment when Eddie starts talking to Dylan, right? Because it deviates to the two of them for a second, and Dylan asks the first question that any kid would probably ask in this circumstance: why didn't you want me? And it's crushing, right? Like, it's a crushing experience, because Dylan is basically coming to terms with the fact that his father's Eddie Brock. And the question is like, where have you been all this time? And if you were out there as a superhero and you were protecting people and you were saving the world, why weren't you saving me from like an abusive person who I thought was my dad, only to turn out it was my granddad who was beating on me and different things like that? Why weren't you protecting me? Like, why weren't you helping me? And it's emotional and it's raw and it's vulnerable, because it's a legitimate question, like, why weren't you helping me? And it's so amazing to see. This is why I love Donny Cates' Venom so much, because it humanizes Eddie Brock. It takes him away from like the guy who has a Venom symbiote and he fights people and then he gets defeated and then the story's over, right? It takes it away from all that and it turns it into like a character-driven story, which I absolutely adore. And so the response he says is, I will always protect you. No matter what happens, I will always protect you and I will always keep you safe. And so the statement is, no more secrets between the two of us. The entire time, Dylan keeping a secret from Eddie Brock. Keeping a secret from him. And so it's kind of funny because it's like, tell me about my mom, tell me about this, and just the two of them kind of bonding, which is a beautiful moment between the two. And I really want to see how that comes out. And so in response to this, we jump back to the Maker again, right? We jump back to Ultimate Reed. And basically this disembodied person who we only really see a portion of him basically says, okay, it's cool that you discovered all this, but none of this has to do with Project Oversight. So give us information on Project Oversight. How's all this progressing? And that's when we learn that what Ultimate Reed has done is he's basically constructed the bridge. Now, the reason why I say the bridge is because during Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four run, what had happened is Reed Richards from the main Marvel universe, the one that you guys are all familiar with, he constructed the bridge. And the bridge basically allowed him to look into and even enter other universes, right? It really made its return during the events of Avengers and New Avengers. For those of you guys who saw that portion of the story with the New Avengers run, and we were seeing like all these alternate reality versions of the Illuminati, that was them just looking through this kind of bridge and seeing what was on the other side and looking into all these other universes that were out there. But what Ultimate Reed has been trying to do is recreate the bridge for the purpose of getting back into the Ultimate Universe. Now, for those of you guys who haven't been keeping track of Marvel, the Ultimate Universe has been back for quite some time. In fact, it returned during Brian Michael Bendis' Spider-Man 2 story, which came out quite some time ago. I want to say maybe a year and a half ago. So it's been back for a little while. Marvel hasn't really done anything with it. It's kind of been like, maybe it's referenced here, maybe it's referenced there, and that's basically it. But we do know that it's back. The issue is that Reed can't really access it. And so that's the idea, is to try to find a way to get in. But a way out is a way in. And so what this means is that when he constructed the bridge, while he couldn't really pass through the dimensional rift and make it to the other side, something else did come through, which is the Ultimate Universe version of the Venom symbiote. Now, when it comes to the Ultimate Universe version of Venom, it's not like the main Marvel universe, right? Where the Venom symbiote is an actual symbiote that's basically an alien race called the Clintar. Instead, in the Ultimate Universe, it was biologically engineered. Now, a lot of that's because of the fact that the Ultimate Universe was designed to be more grounded and less like fantasy, sort of, rooted in like fantasy and sci-fi. And so the way this played out is originally you had two versions of the Venom symbiote suit. You had the original suit that was developed by Richard Parker and Eddie Brock Sr., which was ultimately taken by Trask Industries when they were tricked out of their ownership of the original symbiote. Following that, they developed a second version which reached stage 2. Now, the original symbiote was destroyed by Peter Parker when it was thrown into a smokestack. The idea behind this is that the stage 2 version of Venom is actually really cool. The way this works is that instead of it basically avoiding Peter Parker's spider sense, it actually overloads it. It enhances strength. It's basically a strength augmentation suit. It has insane healing factor abilities because it was originally designed to be a means to like cure disease and different things like that. So basically the person that it bonds to gets a ridiculous healing factor. They're able to overload Spider-Man's spider sense. The difference here is that because the suit was originally designed for Richard Parker, the ongoing idea throughout the Ultimate Spider-Man comics is that it always wanted to bond itself to somebody in the Parker family line. And because Peter Parker was of course the next person after Richard, it was always trying to find a way to bond itself to Peter and would actually abandon its host in order to bond itself to Peter. But basically what this means is that this version of the Venom symbiote, as it's been brought in by Reed Richards from the Ultimate Universe, appears to be partially incomplete insofar as it's just a sample of the original suit. We don't know how in-depth this sample is, but by virtue of what Reed says, because it's partially incomplete, the reason why he was trying to siphon off all those little bits of the symbiote codices in the beginning of the Absolute Carnage story was to essentially complete this puzzle more or less, to take those bits of the codices and to merge it with the Ultimate Universe Venom suit, essentially merging pieces of the main Marvel Universe Venom suit with the Ultimate Venom suit and kind of create this hybrid suit, and then in turn use that for whatever purpose he ended up wanting to use it for. But the idea is that Reed's always been trying to find a way to return back to his universe, and by successfully creating a bridge to the Ultimate Universe would allow him to essentially achieve his goal, right? It would allow him to complete Project Oversight, whatever that project happens to be, whatever its end goal is. We don't fully know what the end goal of that project is, but we do know that it involves the return of the Council of Reeds. Thank God, I am so happy to see the Council of Reeds. Now, here's one thing to bear in mind. This is not the original council. You'll notice that because, well, at least as far as we're aware, it's not the original council because you don't have the version of Reed Richards who has like the long beard, the three of them who had that like the Infinity Gauntlet, things like that. There are versions of Reed here, but they don't look like the original versions of Reed. Now, from what I understand, and I was actually talking to Amazing Zero, who's one of my fans who's in the Discord server. From what I understand, I think he mentioned that Marvel 2-in-1 explains the return of the Council of Reeds, as well as Dan Slott's Fantastic Four. I stopped reading Marvel 2-in-1 a while ago when the Fantastic Four returned under Dan Slott, but I feel like I should because apparently I'm missing out on a huge amount of stuff. Let me know down in the comments if I'm really missing out, because if I am, then I'm going to go back and read it. But yeah, it's cool to see all this return, right? Because what this does is it sets the stage for the next big event, and that's one of the reasons why I said at the beginning of the video, the ending of Absolute Carnage number 5, and really the ending of the Absolute Carnage story was kind of controversial among fans, because some fans thought, and I was among these, some fans thought it was going to be like a definitive beginning, middle, and end, and when it was done, it was finished, and then it was on to the next gag. This basically ended with a kind of to be continued feel, and essentially it just sort of continues on into whatever story's coming next. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace. All right, so as promised, our shout outs for the producers of the Comics Explained videos, our patrons. I want to give a shout out to Jason C, Austin S, Jason S, Austin H, Philip, and Austin B. We have a lot of Austins in our Patreon, as well as Genosis916. Genosis didn't give us a first and last name, so we kind of had to roll with it. I didn't mention your all's last names, but I want to say thank you to you all. By the way, your Rob Corps rings should be on their way for our Honor Guard members of the Rob Corps. For these special patrons, your custom Rob Corps rings should be on their way. They're being shipped to me. After that, I will have them shipped to you. Stay tuned, keep your eye on Patreon and your messages, and you will hear about them coming to you. Thank you.